The year 1689 brought two revolutions to England. One toppled King James II and placed William of Orange on the throne. The other revolution was quieter, but far more profound. It happened when a 57-year-old physician named John Locke published a book that would demolish 2,000 years of philosophical orthodoxy and rebuild human understanding from the ground up. Locke did not set out to overthrow anything. He simply wanted to understand the limits of human knowledge before philosophers started making grand claims about God, morality, and politics. What he discovered in that investigation would accidentally destroy the intellectual foundations of absolute monarchy, religious persecution, and aristocratic privilege. His modest inquiry into how the mind works became the philosophical blueprint for the modern world. Every time you vote in an election, practice your religion freely, or claim ownership of something you work to create, you are living inside John Locke's revolutionary vision. Part 1. The destruction of innate ideas and the birth of empiricism. John Locke's first and most devastating philosophical move was to attack an idea that almost every educated person in his time accepted as obvious truth. The doctrine of innate ideas held that humans are born with certain knowledge already imprinted on their souls by God or nature. Mathematicians believed we come into the world knowing that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Theologians insisted we are born understanding that God exists and that murder is wrong. Political theorists argued that subjects naturally know they must obey their kings. Locke looked at this entire intellectual edifice and methodically tore it apart. His demolition began with a simple observation that no one had bothered to make before. If humans really possess innate knowledge, then every human being should share the same basic ideas about mathematics, morality, and religion. But they clearly do not. Travel to different parts of the world and you will find people who count differently, worship different gods, and follow completely different moral codes. Some cultures practice polygamy while others enforce monogamy. Some societies treat individual property as sacred, while others share everything communally. Some tribes worship a single divine being, while others believe in multiple gods or no gods at all. If moral and religious knowledge were truly built into human nature, such dramatic variations would be impossible. Locke pressed his attack further by examining children and people with mental disabilities. If we are born knowing fundamental truths, then even the youngest children and those with severe cognitive impairments should demonstrate this knowledge. But they do not. Young children show no understanding of complex moral principles until they are taught them. People with certain types of brain damage lose the ability to grasp mathematical concepts that were supposedly innate. This evidence suggested that all knowledge must be acquired through experience rather than inherited through birth. The implications were staggering. If humans are not born with pre-programmed knowledge about right and wrong, then moral rules are human creations rather than divine commands. If we do not inherit political obligations, then government authority must be justified by something other than natural submission. If mathematical truths are discovered through observation rather than revealed through intuition, then all claims about reality must be tested against sensory evidence. Locke had accidentally undermined every form of traditional authority by simply asking where our ideas actually come from. His positive theory was elegantly simple but revolutionary in its consequences. At birth, the human mind resembles white paper void of all characters, without any ideas whatsoever. All the materials of reason and knowledge come from experience, which provides our understanding with two fountains. The first fountain is sensation, which gives us ideas about external physical objects through our five senses. When you see a red apple, touch a rough stone, hear a loud noise, taste bitter medicine, or smell burning wood, your senses deliver information about the world to your mind. These sensory experiences become simple ideas that serve as the basic building blocks of all human knowledge. The second fountain is reflection, which provides ideas about the operations of our own minds. You can observe yourself thinking, remembering, willing, doubting, believing, reasoning, and experiencing emotions. These internal mental activities become simple ideas, just like sensory experiences do. When you notice yourself feeling angry, making a decision, or trying to solve a problem, reflection supplies your understanding with ideas about psychological processes. Together, sensation and reflection furnish all the materials that human reason can work with. Nothing exists in the understanding that was not first present in sensation or reflection. Locke distinguished between simple and complex ideas with surgical precision. Simple ideas cannot be broken down into smaller components and cannot be created or destroyed by human will. When you look at snow, you automatically receive simple ideas of whiteness and coldness that your mind cannot alter or avoid. When you taste sugar, the simple idea of sweetness appears in your consciousness whether you want it or not. These basic sensory and reflective experiences provide the raw materials that the mind then combines, compares and abstracts to form complex ideas. Complex ideas result from mental operations performed on simple ideas. The mind can combine multiple simple ideas to create new complex ones. Your complex idea of a golden mountain combines the simple idea of gold with the simple idea of a mountain, even though you have never seen an actual golden mountain. The mind can compare different ideas to notice relationships between them. You understand that lead is heavier than wood by comparing your simple ideas of these two substances. The mind can abstract general concepts from particular experiences by focusing on similarities while ignoring differences. Your general idea of roundness comes from abstracting the common feature shared by balls, wheels, coins, and planets, while disregarding their differences in size, color, and material. This process explains how humans develop sophisticated knowledge despite starting with completely empty minds. A baby initially receives only scattered simple ideas through random sensory experiences. Gradually, the child learns to combine these simple ideas into complex ones, compare them to notice patterns, and abstract general principles that apply across multiple situations. Through years of accumulating and organizing experiences, the empty slate fills with increasingly sophisticated understanding. But every element of that final understanding can be traced back to particular sensations or reflections that occurred at specific moments in the person's life. Nothing mysterious or supernatural is required to explain human knowledge. Locke's empiricism had immediate practical consequences for how people should approach learning and discovery. Instead of consulting ancient authorities or trusting intuitive hunches, investigators should carefully observe the world and systematically record their experiences. Instead of accepting traditional beliefs without question, thinkers should trace every idea back to the sensory experiences that originally produced it. Any claim that could not be connected to actual observations should be rejected as meaningless speculation. This empirical method would become the foundation of modern scientific inquiry and critical thinking. The theory also suggested new approaches to education and social reform. If children are born without innate knowledge or moral instincts, then their upbringing determines what kind of adults they become. Proper education can eliminate most human vice and ignorance by providing young minds with appropriate experiences and teaching them to organize those experiences correctly. Social problems result from bad ideas rather than corrupt human nature, which means they can be solved through better information and clearer thinking. Locke had opened the door to unlimited human improvement through the careful application of empirical methods to every area of life. Part 2. The state of nature and natural law's universal command. Once Locke had established that humans begin life without innate political obligations, he faced an obvious question. If people are not born naturally subject to kings or governments, what is their original condition? His answer would revolutionize political thinking by imagining human life before any organized society existed. This theoretical starting point, which he called the state of nature, became the foundation for his entire political philosophy. The state of nature is not a historical period that actually existed, but rather a philosophical thought experiment. Imagine stripping away all human institutions like governments, laws, churches, schools, and armies. What would remain is individual human beings living in the world with their natural abilities and needs, but without any artificial authority structures to organize their relationships. In this condition, all people would be perfectly free to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, within the bounds of natural law. They would also be equal, with no person having more power or authority than any other. Neither birth, nor wealth, nor strength, nor intelligence would give anyone the right to command other people or make decisions for them. But this freedom and equality does not mean that the state of nature would be a condition of complete moral chaos. Locke insisted that natural law governs human behavior even without human governments to enforce it. This natural law can be discovered through careful use of human reason applied to empirical observation of the world and human nature. By studying how humans actually function, what they need to survive and flourish, and what kinds of actions promote or destroy human welfare, rational people can deduce universal moral principles. These principles would be the same everywhere and at all times because human nature itself remains constant across cultures and centuries. The fundamental principle of natural law, according to Locke, is that all human beings are the workmanship of one almighty and infinitely wise Creator. As products of divine creation, humans belong ultimately to God rather than to each other. This means that no person has the right to destroy themselves through suicide or to harm others through murder, assault, theft, or enslavement. Natural law commands the preservation of mankind, both individually and collectively. Everyone has a duty to preserve their own life and health when their survival does not conflict with preserving others, and everyone has a duty to help preserve the rest of humanity when doing so does not threaten their own survival. This creates a system of reciprocal obligations that exists independently of any human agreement or governmental enforcement. Natural law also establishes that every person possesses certain natural rights that exist prior to and independently of any human institution. The right to life means that others cannot kill you except in very specific circumstances like just war or legitimate self-defense. The right to liberty means that others cannot enslave you, imprison you, or control your actions without your voluntary consent. The right to estate or property means that you can acquire ownership of external goods through your own labour and use them as you see fit. These rights are not granted by governments or societies, but exist as natural features of what it means to be a rational human being created by God. Any legitimate government must recognize and protect these rights rather than violate them. However, Locke recognized that the state of nature would face serious practical problems despite being governed by natural law. While rational people could discover moral principles through reason, not everyone would be perfectly rational all the time. Some individuals would be biased in their own favor when interpreting what natural law requires in specific situations. Others would be tempted to violate natural law when they thought they could get away with it. Still others would make honest mistakes about what morality demands in complex cases. Without an impartial authority to interpret natural law consistently and enforce it fairly, conflicts would be inevitable and resolution would be difficult. Most seriously, the state of nature lacks three crucial elements that make social life function smoothly. First, it lacks an established, settled, known law that clearly specifies what natural law requires in particular circumstances. While the general principles of natural law can be discovered by reason, their application to specific cases often involves difficult judgment calls that different people might resolve differently. Second, it lacks a known and impartial judge with authority to determine disputes according to established law. When two people disagree about whether one has violated the other's rights, there is no neutral third party to settle the matter definitively. Third, it lacks power to back and support the sentence when right and to give it due execution. Even when everyone agrees that someone has acted wrongly, there may be no effective way to force them to make amends or prevent them from repeating their offence. These deficiencies would make the state of nature inconvenient and insecure for rational people who wanted to live peacefully and prosperously. Disputes would escalate into cycles of retaliation and counter-retaliation. People would waste enormous time and energy defending their rights instead of using their labour productively. The constant threat of conflict would make long-term planning and cooperation difficult. Rational individuals would therefore have strong incentives to establish organised society with clear laws, impartial judges, and reliable enforcement mechanisms. But they would only do so on terms that preserved their natural rights and improved their condition compared to the state of nature. No reasonable person would agree to create a government that made their lives worse than they would be without any government at all. Part 3. Property rights and the labour theory of ownership. The question of property presented Locke with one of his greatest philosophical challenges. If humans begin in a state of nature where the earth and all its resources belong equally to everyone, how does anyone acquire the right to exclude others from particular things? Traditional answers relied on conquest, inheritance, or royal grants. But these explanations could not justify original ownership. Locke needed to explain how private property could legitimately emerge from an initial condition of common ownership without requiring everyone's consent to every individual appropriation. His solution became one of the most influential theories in the history of economics and political philosophy. Every person has exclusive ownership of their own body, and therefore of the labour that their body performs. When someone mixes their labour with natural resources that belong to everyone in common, they acquire private ownership of the resulting product. This happens automatically without requiring permission from other people, provided that certain conditions are met. The labour theory of property explains how individuals can legitimately claim things for themselves while starting from a condition where everything belongs to everyone. Consider a specific example to see how this process works. Imagine a person living in the state of nature who finds wild apple trees growing in an unclaimed forest. The trees and their fruit initially belong to all humanity in common, so this person has no special claim to the apples. But when they climb the trees, pick the fruit, and carry it back to their dwelling, they have mixed their labour with these particular apples in a way that separates them from the common stock. The effort of harvesting, transporting and preparing the apples for consumption makes them private property belonging exclusively to the person who performed this work. Anyone else who tried to take these apples would be stealing the fruit of someone else's labour, which would violate natural law. The same principle applies to more complex forms of production and improvement. Someone who clears a plot of wilderness, prepares the soil, plants seeds, tends growing crops, and harvests the final product has mixed extensive labour with the raw materials provided by nature. The resulting farm and its produce belong to the person who created them through sustained effort over time. Similarly, someone who builds a house from natural materials has combined their labour with wood, stone and other resources to create something new that becomes their private property. The more labour someone invests in transforming natural resources, the stronger their claim to ownership becomes. Property rights reward productive effort and encourage people to use their talents to create valuable goods and services. However, Locke imposed important limitations on property acquisition to ensure that private ownership serves the common good rather than undermining it. The spoilage limitation requires that people only take as much as they can use before it goes bad. Someone who picks more apples than they can eat before the fruit rots has violated natural law by wasting resources that could have benefited other people. This prevents hoarding and ensures that private appropriation does not reduce the total amount of useful goods available to humanity. As long as people only claim what they can actually use, their private ownership increases overall wealth, rather than merely redistributing it. The sufficiency limitation requires that there must be enough and as good left in common for others after someone makes a private appropriation. If claiming a particular resource would leave other people worse off than they were before, then that appropriation violates natural law, even if it involves mixing labour with natural materials. This ensures that private property emerges only when it makes everyone better off, or at least leaves everyone as well off as they were initially. Property rights must serve human flourishing generally, rather than benefiting some people at the expense of others. Locke argued that these limitations are naturally self-enforcing in most circumstances. Someone who picks more fruit than they can eat wastes their own labour as well as natural resources, so they have personal incentives to avoid over-appropriation. Someone who claims land that they cannot effectively use gains nothing valuable while depriving themselves of opportunities to create wealth through more intensive cultivation of smaller areas. Rational people will naturally tend to claim only as much property as they can improve through their labour, because anything beyond that amount provides no benefit to the owner. The introduction of money, however, fundamentally changes the dynamics of property acquisition. Durable currencies like gold and silver do not spoil over time, so people can accumulate them indefinitely without violating the spoilage limitation. By selling their surplus produce for money, individuals can effectively preserve the value of their labour, even when they have created more than they can personally consume. This allows for much greater accumulation of wealth than would be possible in a pure barter economy, where all goods eventually decay. Money also enables specialization and trade by providing a universal medium of exchange that everyone accepts. People can focus on producing whatever they make most efficiently and then trade their surplus for other goods they need. But monetary systems also create new possibilities for inequality and potential violations of natural law. Some people may accumulate vast fortunes while others struggle to meet their basic needs, even though everyone theoretically has equal access to natural resources. Wealthy individuals might buy up large quantities of land and other productive assets, making it difficult for others to find sufficient opportunities to mix their labour with natural materials. This could violate the sufficiency limitation by leaving some people worse off than they would have been in pure state of nature. Locke acknowledged these concerns, but argued that the increased productivity made possible by money and trade generally benefits everyone, including the poorest members of society. Even a common labourer in a civilized nation lives better than a king in primitive conditions because monetary exchange enables much more efficient use of human talents and natural resources. Part 4. The Social Contract and the Foundation of Legitimate Government. The inconveniences of the state of nature would eventually motivate rational people to seek a better arrangement through voluntary agreement. But what kind of agreement could legitimately create governmental authority over free and equal individuals who owe obedience to no one but God and natural law? Locke's answer required him to explain both why people would give up some of their natural freedom and what limits that voluntary surrender would place on governmental power. His social contract theory became the philosophical foundation for modern democratic government and constitutional law. The social contract is not a single historical event, but rather an ongoing process by which free people create and maintain organized society. It begins when individuals who are living in the state of nature recognize that they would all benefit from establishing common institutions to resolve disputes and coordinate their activities. These people voluntarily agree to give up their natural right to enforce the law of nature themselves and instead submit to the judgment of impartial authorities who will apply consistent rules fairly to everyone. By pooling their individual enforcement powers, they create a collective authority that is stronger and more reliable than any individual could be acting alone. But they only surrender those specific powers that are necessary to achieve the benefits of organized society while retaining all other aspects of their natural freedom. The fundamental purpose of this agreement is to preserve and protect the natural rights that people possessed in the state of nature. Government exists to do collectively what individuals had the right, but not the practical ability, to do effectively by themselves. Just as individuals in the state of nature could legitimately defend their life, liberty and property against unjust attack, organized society can legitimately use collective force to defend these same rights more systematically and impartially. But governmental authority extends only as far as this protective function requires, and no further. Any use of political power that goes beyond preserving natural rights violates the terms of the social contract and loses its legitimacy. Government is the servant of the people who created it, not their master. This means that legitimate political authority has strict limits built into its very foundation. Government cannot violate the natural rights it was created to protect without contradicting its own reason for existence. Officials cannot take people's lives arbitrarily because the right to life was one of the natural rights that the social contract was designed to secure. They cannot enslave citizens or control their actions without consent because the right to liberty was another natural right that motivated the original agreement. They cannot confiscate private property without due process and compensation because property rights were among the most important reasons why people agreed to leave the state of nature. A government that systematically violates natural rights has broken the social contract and forfeited any claim to obedience from its citizens. Locke insisted that consent is both the source of governmental authority and the ongoing condition for its continued legitimacy. The original social contract must be genuinely voluntary, with each person freely choosing to join organized society rather than being forced into it by threats or deception. But consent cannot be a one-time event that permanently binds people and their descendants to whatever their government chooses to do. Each generation must have the opportunity to affirm or modify the terms of the social contract based on their own experience and judgment. Ongoing consent can be expressed through formal political participation, like voting and holding office, but it can also be withdrawn through resistance and revolution when government becomes destructive of the ends for which it was established. The people always retain ultimate sovereignty because they are the source from which governmental authority derives. This creates a crucial distinction between legitimate government and mere force or conquest. A robber who demands your money at gunpoint has power over you, but not authority, because you have not consented to his rule and he is not acting to protect your natural rights. Similarly, a conqueror who subdues a territory through military force may be able to compel obedience, but cannot claim legitimate authority over the conquered people until they voluntarily accept his rule. Even the most successful conquest creates only a temporary situation of superior force that must eventually be converted into genuine consent if it is to become morally legitimate government. History is full of rulers who confused their ability to inflict punishment with their right to demand obedience, but Locke's theory shows that these two things are completely different. Power without consent is tyranny, regardless of how effectively it maintains order or how benevolent its intentions might be. The social contract also establishes important principles about how governmental decisions should be made. Since the purpose of organized society is to protect natural rights more effectively than individuals could do alone, governmental policies must be designed to serve this protective function rather than advancing the personal interests of officials. Laws should be general rules that apply equally to everyone rather than arbitrary commands that benefit some people at the expense of others. They should be publicly known in advance so that citizens can plan their actions accordingly rather than being surprised by retroactive punishments. They should be enforced impartially without regard to wealth, social status, or political connections. And they should be subject to change through regular procedures that allow the people to modify their government when experience shows that reforms are needed. These principles of rule of law, equal treatment, and democratic accountability all flow from the basic insight that government is created by free people to serve their common interests rather than to dominate them. Part 5. The separation of powers and constitutional government. Having established that legitimate government must be based on popular consent and limited to protecting natural rights, Locke faced another crucial question. How should governmental power be organized to ensure that it serves its proper purposes without becoming tyrannical? His answer involved dividing political authority among different branches with distinct functions. so that no individual or group could accumulate enough power to threaten the rights and freedoms that government was created to protect. This separation of powers doctrine became a cornerstone of modern constitutional design. Locke identified three essential governmental functions that should be kept separate to prevent the abuse of power. The legislative function involves making general laws that specify what natural law requires in the particular circumstances of a given society. Since natural law provides only broad principles like preserving life and respecting property, organized societies need more detailed rules about things like traffic regulations, commercial contracts, and criminal procedures. The legislative power creates these specific laws through representatives who are chosen by the people and accountable to them for their decisions. Because the legislative branch most directly expresses the will of the citizens who created government, Locke considered it the supreme power in any legitimate political system. All other governmental authorities must operate within the framework established by properly enacted legislation. The executive function involves implementing and enforcing the laws that the legislature has created. This requires a separate branch because lawmaking and law enforcement involve different skills and face different temptations. Legislators need to deliberate carefully about general principles and long-term consequences, which works best in relatively large assemblies that can consider multiple viewpoints. Executives need to make quick decisions about specific cases and coordinate complex administrative activities, which works best with smaller groups that can act decisively. If the same people who made the laws were also responsible for enforcing them, they would be tempted to create rules that served their personal interests, and to apply those rules unfairly to benefit their friends and harm their enemies. Separating legislative and executive power reduces these dangers by ensuring that different people are responsible for creating and implementing governmental policies. The federative function involves managing relationships with other nations, including diplomacy, trade negotiations, and decisions about war and peace. Locke recognized that this power differs significantly from domestic executive authority because it deals with entities that are not bound by the same legal system. Foreign policy often requires secrecy, speed, and flexibility that would be impossible if every decision had to be debated publicly in a large legislative assembly. It also involves judgments about rapidly changing international circumstances that cannot be anticipated when laws are written. While the federative power must operate within general guidelines established by the legislature, it needs considerable discretion to respond effectively to external threats and opportunities. This creates potential tensions between democratic accountability and practical effectiveness that every constitutional system must somehow resolve. The separation of these powers serves several important purposes beyond simply preventing tyranny. It creates a system of checks and balances where each branch can limit the other's ability to exceed their proper authority. The legislature can refuse to fund executive activities that go beyond implementing lawfully enacted policies. The executive can decline to enforce legislative acts that violate constitutional limits on governmental power. The people can replace legislators who create bad laws or executives who enforce good laws badly. This mutual accountability makes it difficult for any single branch to ignore the others or to act without considering the broader consequences of their decisions. Separation of powers also promotes specialization and expertise by allowing each branch to focus on what it does best. Legislators can concentrate on the complex task of crafting general rules that will work fairly across many different situations. Executives can develop the administrative skills needed to implement those rules efficiently and consistently. Federative officials can acquire the diplomatic knowledge and international experience that effective foreign policy requires. Rather than forcing the same people to master all aspects of government, constitutional separation allows for division of labor that improves performance in each area. Citizens benefit from having specialists handle the different functions of government, rather than generalists who may lack the expertise that complex modern governance requires. However, Locke recognized that formal separation of powers would be meaningless without proper institutional design to support it. Each branch needs independent sources of authority that do not depend on the goodwill of the other branches. Legislators should be chosen directly by the people through regular elections that give citizens meaningful choices between different candidates and platforms. Executives should have secure tenure for fixed terms that allow them to resist temporary popular pressures while remaining ultimately accountable to the electorate. The different branches should have overlapping but not identical constituencies, so that no single faction can control all aspects of government simultaneously, and there should be clear procedures for resolving conflicts between the branches that do not require any branch to judge its own cause. Most importantly, the separation of powers must be supported by a broader culture of constitutional government that values limited authority and individual rights. Formal institutional arrangements can help prevent the abuse of power, but they cannot guarantee it if citizens and officials do not understand and accept the principles that justify those arrangements. People must believe that governmental authority is legitimate only when it serves the common good within constitutional limits, and they must be willing to resist when government exceeds those limits, regardless of which party controls which branch. The separation of powers is ultimately a means to the end of preserving natural rights and popular consent, not an end in itself. Its value depends on how well it serves these deeper purposes in the particular circumstances that each society faces. Part 6. Religious Toleration and the Limits of Civil Authority. The question of religious diversity presented 17th-century Europe with one of its most explosive political problems. Catholics and Protestants had been slaughtering each other for more than a century, each side convinced that God demanded the destruction of heretical beliefs. Rulers used religious differences to justify wars of conquest, while subjects used theological disputes to justify rebellion against their governments. Into this chaos, Locke introduced a radical solution that would fundamentally transform the relationship between church and state. His theory of religious toleration became the foundation for modern principles of freedom of conscience and separation of religion from politics. Locke's argument began with a careful analysis of what religion actually is and what functions it properly serves in human life. True religion, he argued, consists in the inward and sincere persuasion of the mind about divine matters, not in outward conformity to particular ceremonies or creeds. Religious faith must emerge from genuine conviction based on careful consideration of evidence and arguments. Because God cannot be pleased by worship that is merely external compliance with human commands. Someone who attends church services only because the law requires it, while secretly believing something completely different, has not been converted to true religion, but has simply been taught to lie about their deepest convictions. Authentic religious commitment cannot be produced by force, threats, or legal penalties, because these external pressures cannot change what people actually believe in their hearts and minds. The very nature of religious faith makes governmental coercion both ineffective and counterproductive. This analysis led to a crucial distinction between the proper spheres of civil and ecclesiastical authority. Civil government exists to protect citizens' temporal interests like life, liberty, health and property through the use of physical force and legal sanctions. Its tools include police, courts, armies, taxes, fines, imprisonment, and other forms of external compulsion that can control outward behavior. Religious institutions exist to promote spiritual salvation through teaching, persuasion, example, and voluntary association. Their proper tools include preaching, counseling, education, ritual, prayer, and social encouragement or disapproval, but they should not use physical force to compel belief or worship. Each type of institution has legitimate authority within its own domain, but neither should interfere with the proper functioning of the other. The separation of civil and religious authority serves the interests of both government and religion. When political officials try to control religious belief, they inevitably corrupt their own institutions by turning them into instruments of theological controversy rather than impartial protectors of all citizens' rights. Religious minorities become second-class citizens who cannot fully participate in political life because their beliefs are legally suspect. Religious majorities become dependent on governmental support, rather than developing the intellectual and moral strength that comes from having to persuade others through reason and example. The quality of both politics and religion suffers when they become entangled with each other instead of focusing on their distinct, proper purposes. Separation allows each institution to do what it does best without being distracted by responsibilities that belong to others. Locke's toleration extended beyond simply preventing government from favouring one Christian denomination over others. He argued that civil authority has no competence to judge theological questions about the nature of God, the requirements for salvation, or the proper forms of worship. These are matters that must be resolved through careful study of religious texts, philosophical reasoning about divine attributes, and personal spiritual experience that cannot be evaluated by political criteria. Government officials have no special expertise in theology that would qualify them to decide which religious beliefs are true and which are false. More importantly, they have no legitimate authority to impose their theological judgments on other people, even if those judgments happen to be correct. Religious truth is too important to be left to politicians and soldiers who must focus their attention on secular matters like maintaining public order and protecting individual rights. However, Locke did not advocate unlimited religious freedom that would exempt religious believers from all civil laws. When religious practices conflict with the legitimate requirements of civil government, the civil law must prevail within its proper sphere. A religious group that practiced human sacrifice could not claim exemption from laws against murder by arguing that their rituals expressed sincere theological convictions. Religious believers who refused to pay taxes or serve in the military when required could not escape these civic obligations simply because their faith discouraged such activities. The principle of toleration protects religious belief and worship from governmental interference, but it does not create a general exemption from civil law for people who have religious objections to particular governmental policies. Religious liberty means freedom of conscience, not freedom from the ordinary responsibilities of citizenship. Locke also placed important limits on which religious groups deserved toleration from civil authority. He excluded Catholics from full religious freedom because he believed their loyalty to the Pope created divided allegiance that was incompatible with good citizenship. He excluded atheists because he thought their lack of religious belief removed the moral constraints that made social cooperation possible. and he excluded any religious groups that claimed the right to use force against those who disagreed with their theological views. These exclusions reflected the particular political circumstances of 17th century England more than the logical implications of his general theory, and later thinkers would extend toleration to groups that Locke had excluded. But they illustrate his recognition that religious freedom, like all other rights, must be exercised within limits that preserve the basic conditions necessary for organized society to function effectively. The practical implementation of religious toleration required careful attention to institutional design and legal procedures. Laws concerning religion should be written in general terms that apply equally to all denominations rather than targeting particular groups for special treatment. Religious tests for public office should be eliminated so that citizens' political participation does not depend on their theological beliefs. Public funding should not support religious institutions or activities because this would force taxpayers to subsidize beliefs they may conscientiously reject. Legal disputes involving religious matters should be resolved by secular courts using civil law rather than by ecclesiastical authorities using religious law. These institutional arrangements help ensure that the separation between civil and religious authority remains clear and effective rather than being undermined by informal practices that blur the boundaries between different spheres of human activity. Part 7. Personal Identity and the Unity of Consciousness. Among all of John Locke's philosophical contributions, perhaps none has generated more puzzlement and debate than his analysis of personal identity. The question seems deceptively simple at first. What makes you the same person today that you were 10 years ago, or even yesterday? Your body has changed significantly during that time, with most of your cells dying and being replaced by new ones. Your beliefs, preferences and personality may have evolved dramatically as you gained new experiences and matured intellectually. Your social roles, relationships and responsibilities have probably shifted in important ways. So in what sense can we say that you are literally the same person who existed in the past, rather than simply a different person who happens to inhabit a similar body? Locke's answer would revolutionize philosophy of mind and raise profound questions about moral responsibility, legal accountability, and the nature of human selfhood. Traditional answers to the personal identity question typically focused on either the soul or the body as the foundation of continuing selfhood. Religious thinkers generally argued that each person possesses an immaterial soul that remains numerically identical throughout life and potentially beyond death. This soul serves as the metaphysical anchor that makes you the same person, despite all the physical and psychological changes you undergo over time. Materialist philosophers, by contrast, typically argued that personal identity consists in the continuity of the same physical body, particularly the brain and nervous system. As long as your body maintains unbroken biological continuity from birth through death, you remain the same person regardless of what psychological changes may occur. Both approaches seemed to provide clear answers to puzzling cases, but Locke found serious problems with each of them. The soul theory faces the fundamental difficulty that souls are unobservable and their properties cannot be determined through empirical investigation. Since all knowledge comes from sensation and reflection, according to Locke's empiricism, we cannot have any clear ideas about immaterial substances that exist beyond the reach of our senses. More problematically, the soul theory leads to counterintuitive conclusions about personal identity in hypothetical cases. If the same soul could potentially animate different bodies at different times, then a person could theoretically survive complete bodily destruction and continue existing in an entirely different physical form. But if someone appeared with completely different memories, personality and psychological characteristics than you currently possess, it would be difficult to maintain that they were really the same person as you, regardless of what happened to souls at the metaphysical level. Personal identity seems to require some kind of psychological continuity that the soul theory cannot guarantee. The body theory faces similar objections from the opposite direction. If personal identity consists simply in physical continuity, then someone who suffered complete memory loss and total personality change would still be the same person as long as their body remained biologically intact. But this conclusion conflicts strongly with our ordinary understanding of what it means to be a particular person. We typically think that someone's memories, beliefs, values and character traits are more central to their identity than the particular physical matter that happens to constitute their body at any given time. Moreover, the body theory cannot easily handle cases where the same physical organism supports multiple distinct personalities, as in certain psychological disorders, or where a single personality could theoretically be transferred between different physical bodies. Personal identity seems to be more closely connected to psychological than to physical continuity. Locke's revolutionary solution was to ground personal identity entirely in the continuity of memory and consciousness rather than in either souls or bodies. A person, according to his definition, is a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as itself, the same thinking thing, in different times and places. What makes this possible is memory, which allows consciousness to extend backward in time and connect present experiences with past experiences in a continuous stream of awareness. You are the same person who performed some action in the past, if and only if you can remember performing that action from a first-person perspective. The self is constructed through memory's ability to unite different temporal stages of experience into a single ongoing narrative of personal existence. Without memory, there would be no personal identity, only a series of disconnected moments of consciousness with no unifying principle to bind them together. This memory theory of personal identity generates fascinating thought experiments that illuminate its implications and potential problems. Imagine a prince and a cobbler who somehow exchange memories while keeping their original bodies, so that the person in the prince's body remembers growing up poor and learning to make shoes, while the person in the cobbler's body remembers royal education and palace life. According to Locke's theory, the real prince is now in the cobbler's body because that is where the princely memories and consciousness reside. Personal identity follows consciousness rather than physical form, so we should treat the person with princely memories as the rightful heir to the throne regardless of what body those memories currently inhabit. This conclusion may seem strange, but Locke argued that it matches our intuitive understanding of what makes someone a particular person better than theories based on souls or bodies alone. We care more about psychological continuity than physical or metaphysical continuity when we think about personal relationships and social responsibilities. The memory theory also has profound implications for moral and legal responsibility. If personal identity depends on memory, then someone who has completely forgotten committing a crime may no longer be the same person who should be punished for that crime. Locke acknowledged this implication and argued that perfect justice would indeed require taking memory into account when assigning responsibility for past actions. However, He recognized that human legal systems cannot reliably determine what people really remember versus what they claim to remember. So practical considerations may require holding people accountable for actions performed by their bodies, even when they deny remembering those actions. The theory establishes the ideal standard for moral responsibility while acknowledging the practical limitations that human institutions face in implementing that standard perfectly. Justice is complicated by the epistemological problems that arise when we try to apply philosophical theories to real-world situations where complete knowledge is unavailable. Critics of the memory theory have raised several objections that continue to challenge philosophers today. The circular reasoning objection points out that remembering a past experience seems to presuppose that you are the same person who had that experience in the first place. You cannot remember doing something unless you actually did it yourself, which means personal identity is logically prior to memory rather than being constituted by memory. The forgotten experiences objection notes that people forget vast numbers of experiences that they definitely had. So memory cannot be necessary for personal identity, or else you would cease to be the same person whenever you forgot something. The false memory objection observes that people sometimes remember experiences they never actually had, so memory cannot be sufficient for personal identity, or else you would become identical with people whose experiences you mistakenly think you remember. These objections have led philosophers to develop more sophisticated theories that preserve Locke's psychological insights while avoiding the specific problems that arise from focusing exclusively on memory. Part 8. The Philosophy of Education and Human Development. If the human mind truly begins as a blank slate that acquires all knowledge through experience, then education becomes the most powerful force in determining what kind of people we become. This insight led Locke to develop detailed theories about how children should be raised and taught to maximize their potential for wisdom, virtue, and happiness. His educational philosophy challenged traditional approaches that emphasized rote memorization and harsh discipline, proposing instead methods based on careful observation of how learning actually occurs in young minds. These ideas would influence educational reformers for centuries and continue to shape debates about child development today. Locke's educational theory rested on several key insights about the nature of childhood learning. First, children are naturally curious and eager to understand the world around them, but this curiosity can be easily destroyed by inappropriate teaching methods that make learning unpleasant or frightening. Second, young minds learn most effectively through concrete experiences and practical activities, rather than through abstract principles and verbal instruction alone. Third, moral character develops through habituation and practice, rather than through lectures about ethics and virtue. Fourth, different children have different temperaments, abilities, and interests that require individualized approaches rather than uniform treatment for all students. And fifth, the ultimate goal of education should be to produce independent, rational adults who can think critically and act responsibly rather than obedient followers who simply accept authority without question. Traditional education in Locke's era focused heavily on teaching Latin grammar, classical literature, and formal logic through methods that emphasized memorization, repetition, and corporal punishment for mistakes. Students spent years learning to conjugate Latin verbs and parse complex sentences in ancient texts that had little relevance to their daily lives or future careers. Teachers used physical beating and public humiliation to motivate learning, creating classroom environments filled with fear and resentment rather than intellectual excitement. Locke observed that this approach often produced adults who could recite classical authors from memory but could not reason effectively about practical problems or communicate clearly in their native language. Worse, it frequently destroyed children's natural love of learning by associating education with pain and boredom rather than discovery and growth. A better educational system would build on children's inherent curiosity rather than crushing it through inappropriate methods. Locke's alternative approach emphasized engaging children's natural interests and making learning enjoyable rather than painful. Instead of forcing young students to memorize abstract grammatical rules, teachers should help them learn language by reading interesting stories and having conversations about topics that genuinely fascinate them. Instead of requiring children to copy classical authors' rhetorical styles, teachers should encourage them to express their own thoughts clearly and persuasively about subjects they care about. Instead of using fear and punishment to motivate academic effort, teachers should create positive incentives that make children want to learn because learning itself is rewarding and fun. When education becomes a source of pleasure rather than suffering, students develop lifelong habits of intellectual curiosity that serve them well beyond their formal schooling years. The goal is to create independent learners who continue educating themselves throughout their lives rather than passive recipients who stop learning as soon as external requirements are removed. Moral education presented special challenges that required particularly careful attention to methods and timing. Young children cannot understand complex ethical theories or abstract principles of justice, so traditional approaches that relied on philosophical instruction were largely ineffective. Instead, moral character must be developed through repeated practice of good behaviors until those behaviors become automatic habits that operate without conscious reflection. Parents and teachers should create situations where children naturally act with honesty, kindness, courage and self-control, then praise and reward these behaviors to reinforce their development. Over time, doing the right thing becomes second nature because the child has practiced it so many times in so many different contexts that it feels natural and comfortable. This habituation approach requires patient, consistent guidance from adults who model the virtues they want to cultivate in their children. However, Locke emphasized that moral habituation must eventually give way to rational understanding as children mature intellectually. Adults who act morally only because they were trained to do so in childhood lack the intellectual foundation necessary for ethical behavior in novel situations that were not covered by their early training. True moral autonomy requires understanding the reasons why certain actions are right or wrong, not just knowing which behaviors adults approve or disapprove. Education must therefore gradually shift from external guidance toward internal reasoning as students develop the cognitive abilities necessary for independent moral judgment. The final goal is to produce adults who choose to act ethically because they understand why ethics matters, not because they are still following childhood habits or seeking approval from authority figures. This requires careful timing to ensure that rational instruction builds on rather than undermines the foundation of good habits established during earlier stages of development. Physical education and health receive significant attention in Locke's educational program because he recognized the intimate connection between bodily and mental development. Children need regular exercise, fresh air, adequate sleep, and proper nutrition to support the brain development that makes intellectual learning possible. They also need to develop physical skills like coordination, strength, and endurance that will serve them throughout their lives. But physical education should emphasize enjoyable activities that children want to participate in rather than tedious exercises that feel like punishment. Games, sports, dancing and outdoor exploration provide natural opportunities for physical development, while also teaching social skills like cooperation, fair play, and graceful handling of both victory and defeat. The artificial separation between physical and intellectual education that characterized traditional schooling ignored the reality that humans are integrated beings whose bodily and mental capacities develop together. Locke also pioneered ideas about individualized instruction that recognized the unique qualities of each child rather than treating all students identically. Some children learn best through visual demonstrations, while others respond better to verbal explanations or hands-on manipulation of physical objects. Some have natural aptitudes for mathematics, while others excel in languages or artistic endeavors. Some are naturally sociable and thrive in group activities, while others prefer solitary reflection and independent work. Effective education must adapt to these individual differences rather than forcing all children through identical programs, regardless of their particular strengths, weaknesses, and interests. This requires teachers who understand child development and can modify their methods based on careful observation of how each student responds to different approaches. The goal is to help every child reach their full potential rather than to produce uniform graduates who all think and act the same way. Part 9. Economic Theory and the Origins of Wealth. Locke's analysis of property rights led him to develop sophisticated theories about economics that challenged traditional assumptions about wealth and poverty. Medieval thinking typically treated the total amount of wealth in the world as fixed, so that one person's gain necessarily came at another person's expense. This zero-sum mentality justified strict social hierarchies where nobles enjoyed luxury while peasants lived in poverty, because any attempt to improve the condition of the poor would supposedly require taking wealth away from the rich. Locke's labour theory of property suggested a radically different understanding of economic activity that emphasized wealth creation rather than wealth redistribution. By mixing labour with natural resources, industrious people could increase the total amount of valuable goods and services available to humanity rather than simply redistributing existing wealth from one group to another. This insight became fundamental to modern economic thinking about productivity, growth and development. The key to understanding Locke's economic theory lies in recognizing his distinction between the natural value of resources and the added value created through human labor. A piece of unused land in its natural state has relatively little value because it produces only what grows wild without human intervention. But when someone clears that land, prepares the soil, plants crops, tends them carefully, and harvests the resulting produce, they have dramatically increased its productivity and value. The improved land can now feed many more people than it could in its natural state, creating genuine wealth that did not exist before human labour was applied to natural resources. This value creation benefits not only the person who performed the labour, but also everyone else who can now purchase the additional food that the improved land produces. Economic activity becomes a positive sum game, where industrious people can become wealthy without making others poorer. Locke used specific numerical examples to illustrate how dramatically human labour increases the value of natural resources. He estimated that in well-cultivated lands, 99% of the value comes from labour, while only 1% comes from the natural materials provided by the earth itself. An acre of wheat in England produces far more food value than an acre of equally fertile land in America that remains uncultivated by its native inhabitants. The difference comes entirely from the agricultural techniques, tools, and sustained effort that English farmers apply to their land. Similarly, a piece of manufactured goods like cloth or furniture contains primarily the value added by human skill and effort rather than the value of the raw materials from which it was made. This analysis suggested that differences in wealth between nations and individuals could be explained primarily by differences in industriousness, knowledge, and economic organization rather than by differences in natural resource endowments or unfair distribution systems. The introduction of money fundamentally transformed economic relationships by enabling much more complex forms of wealth creation and exchange. In a pure barter economy, people can only trade the specific goods they happen to produce for the specific goods they happen to need, which severely limits the possibilities for specialization and large-scale cooperation. Money solves this problem by providing a universally accepted medium of exchange that allows people to sell their products to anyone and use the proceeds to buy whatever they need from anyone else. This enables individuals to focus their labor on producing whatever they make most efficiently while relying on others to produce everything else they consume. The resulting division of labor dramatically increases overall productivity because people become much more skilled when they specialize in narrow areas rather than trying to produce everything they need by themselves. Even relatively poor people in monetized economies live better than wealthy people in subsistence economies because the efficiency gains from specialization and trade benefit everyone. However, Locke recognized that monetary systems also create new possibilities for inequality and potential injustice. While money allows for much greater wealth creation, it also allows for much greater wealth accumulation by individuals who may end up controlling vastly more resources than they could ever use personally. In a barter economy, someone who produced more food than they could eat would see the surplus spoil, naturally limiting how much they could accumulate. But someone who converts their surplus production into durable money can accumulate indefinitely without violating the spoilage limitation that Locke had identified as a natural constraint on property acquisition. This raises questions about whether unlimited accumulation is consistent with the requirement that appropriation leave enough and as good for others. If wealthy individuals buy up large quantities of productive land and other resources, they may make it difficult for others to find adequate opportunities to mix their labor with natural materials. Locke's response to this concern emphasized the overall benefits that monetary exchange produces for society as a whole. Even if money allows some individuals to accumulate great wealth, the increased productivity made possible by specialization and trade typically benefits everyone, including the poorest members of society. A common laborer in England lives more comfortably than a king among Native Americans who lack developed monetary systems and division of labor. The day laborer has access to better food, clothing, shelter, and tools than tribal chiefs who must rely on what their own communities can produce without the benefits of extensive trade networks. Inequality within monetized societies may be greater than inequality within subsistence societies, but absolute living standards are higher at every level of the social hierarchy. The relevant question is not whether everyone has exactly equal wealth, but whether everyone is better off than they would be under alternative economic arrangements. This analysis led Locke to support relatively free markets with minimal governmental interference in economic activity. Since wealth creation depends primarily on individual initiative and effort, policies that discourage industriousness or prevent people from keeping the fruits of their labor will reduce overall prosperity. Heavy taxation, excessive regulation, and arbitrary government intervention in business decisions discourage the productive activities that generate wealth for society as a whole. The proper role of government in economic matters is to establish clear, consistent rules that protect property rights and enforce contracts, then allow individuals to pursue their own interests through voluntary exchange. This creates incentives for productive behavior while ensuring that economic gains result from creating value for others rather than from using force or fraud to redistribute existing wealth. Markets work best when they operate within a framework of just laws that prevent coercion and deception, but otherwise allow maximum freedom for economic experimentation and innovation. Part 10. The Right of Resistance and Revolutionary Theory. Perhaps no aspect of Locke's political philosophy was more radical or dangerous to established authority than his defence of the right of revolution. In an age when kings claimed divine right and subjects were expected to obey regardless of how badly they were treated, Locke argued that people retain the ultimate authority to judge their governments and replace them when they fail to serve their proper purposes. This doctrine provided philosophical justification for resistance movements that would overthrow absolute monarchies and establish democratic governments throughout the modern world. But it also raised difficult questions about when revolution is justified and who has the authority to decide that governmental change is necessary. Locke's argument for revolutionary rights flowed logically from his social contract theory and his understanding of governmental legitimacy. Since government exists only to protect the natural rights that people possessed in the state of nature, any government that systematically violates those rights has violated the fundamental terms of the social contract. When officials use their power to destroy rather than preserve life, liberty and property, they have acted outside their legitimate authority and forfeited any claim to obedience from citizens. In such circumstances, the people revert to their original natural freedom and may legitimately use force to defend themselves against governmental oppression, just as they could legitimately use force to defend themselves against any other unjust aggressor. The right of revolution is simply the collective exercise of the natural right of self-defense that every individual possesses against those who would harm them without justification. Government officials who abuse their power become enemies of the people rather than their legitimate representatives. However, Locke insisted that revolution should be a last resort used only when all other remedies have failed and the situation has become genuinely intolerable. Governments are human institutions that will inevitably make mistakes and sometimes act unjustly in particular cases, but these occasional failures do not justify overthrowing the entire system. People should endure minor inconveniences and isolated abuses rather than resorting to violence that might produce even worse consequences than the problems they are trying to solve. Revolution is justified only when there is a long train of abuses that demonstrates a clear pattern of systematic oppression rather than mere incompetence or occasional wrongdoing. The government must have shown itself to be fundamentally hostile to the rights and welfare of its citizens rather than simply ineffective at protecting them. And peaceful methods of reform must have been tried and proven inadequate before violent resistance becomes morally acceptable. The decision about when these conditions have been met cannot be left to individual judgment alone, because isolated individuals might mistakenly believe they are being oppressed when they are simply being required to obey legitimate laws they happen to dislike. Revolution requires the consent of the majority of the people, or at least of a substantial portion of the community that represents the general will rather than merely private interests. When large numbers of citizens across different social groups and geographic regions reach similar conclusions about governmental tyranny, this provides evidence that the problems are real and serious rather than imaginary or exaggerated. Popular resistance movements that attract broad support are more likely to be justified than isolated rebellions led by small factions with narrow grievances. The people as a whole must judge whether their government has violated the social contract so severely that revolutionary change is necessary to restore legitimate authority. This collective judgment helps ensure that revolution serves the common good, rather than the private ambitions of particular individuals or groups. Locke identified several specific governmental actions that would clearly justify revolutionary resistance. Any attempt to rule by arbitrary will rather than established law violates the basic principle that legitimate authority must operate through general rules that apply equally to everyone. Any systematic violation of property rights through confiscation, excessive taxation, or other forms of economic oppression undermines one of the fundamental purposes for which government was established. Any attempt to transfer the people's allegiance to a foreign power without their consent destroys the voluntary basis on which legitimate government rests. Any effort to prevent the legislature from meeting or to corrupt the electoral process through which representatives are chosen attacks the institutional mechanisms through which popular consent is expressed. And any pattern of behaviour that shows the government is working systematically against the public good, rather than for it demonstrates that officials have abandoned their proper role as servants of the people. The right of revolution also extends to situations where government becomes ineffective at protecting citizens' rights, even if it is not actively violating those rights. If a government lacks the power to maintain order, enforce laws, and defend against external threats, it has failed in its basic functions, regardless of whether its intentions are benevolent. In such circumstances, the people may legitimately establish new institutions that can actually provide the protection that government is supposed to offer. Effectiveness is not the only requirement for legitimate government, but it is a necessary requirement because ineffective government provides no advantages over the state of nature, while imposing the costs and restrictions that come with organized political authority. People have no obligation to maintain institutions that fail to deliver the benefits for which those institutions were created. The social contract is a mutual agreement that creates obligations for both citizens and officials, so persistent failure by officials to fulfill their part of the bargain releases citizens from their obligations as well. Critics of Locke's revolutionary theory raise several important objections that continue to challenge political theorists today. The instability objection argues that giving people the right to judge and resist their government will lead to constant rebellions that prevent stable institutions from ever developing effectively. The incompetence objection suggests that ordinary citizens lack the knowledge and expertise necessary to evaluate complex governmental policies and may rebel against beneficial programs they do not understand. The faction objection worries that revolutionary rights will be claimed by narrow interest groups that want to advance their private agendas rather than the common good. And the anarchy objection fears that overthrowing established government will lead to chaos and violence that harms everyone regardless of whether the original government deserved to be overthrown. These concerns highlight the tension between popular sovereignty and political stability that every democratic system must somehow resolve. Locke's responses to these objections emphasized both the practical safeguards built into his theory and the moral necessity of preserving ultimate popular control over government. The right of revolution is self-limiting because people will not endure the costs and risks of rebellion unless their grievances are serious and long-standing. Most citizens prefer stability and will tolerate considerable governmental imperfection rather than resort to violence that might make their situation worse. Revolutionary movements require extensive organization and cooperation that is difficult to achieve unless the problems with existing government are genuinely severe and widely recognized. The natural conservatism of most people provides protection against frivolous or premature rebellions while preserving the ultimate remedy against tyranny that cannot be corrected through normal political processes. Without the right of revolution, there would be no effective check on governmental power and no guarantee that officials would remain accountable to the people they are supposed to serve. Part 11. The degrees of knowledge and the architecture of human understanding. Locke's empiricism led him to develop a sophisticated taxonomy of different types of knowledge that humans can achieve, each with its own degree of certainty and its own proper methods of investigation. Not all knowledge is created equal, and understanding these differences is crucial for avoiding both unwarranted skepticism and unjustified dogmatism. By carefully analyzing the various ways that ideas can be related to each other and to external reality, Locke created a framework for evaluating knowledge claims that remains influential in philosophy, science, and education today. His analysis shows why some beliefs deserve complete confidence while others should be held tentatively, and why some questions can be answered definitively while others must remain forever uncertain. The highest degree of knowledge, according to Locke, is intuitive knowledge, which occurs when the mind immediately perceives the agreement or disagreement between ideas without requiring any intermediate steps of reasoning. Mathematical truths like 2 plus 2 equals 4 exemplify intuitive knowledge because anyone who understands the concepts involved can see immediately that the relationship must hold. Similarly, logical principles like something cannot both exist and not exist at the same time are intuitively certain because attempting to deny them leads to immediate contradiction. Intuitive knowledge provides the foundation for all other types of knowledge because it establishes basic principles that cannot be doubted without undermining the very possibility of rational thought. These foundational truths are self-evident in the literal sense that they prove themselves simply by being clearly understood. No external evidence or complex argumentation is required because the mind can perceive their truth directly through careful attention to the ideas themselves. Demonstrative knowledge represents the second highest degree of certainty and includes most of what we call rigorous proof in mathematics, logic, and philosophy. When the relationship between ideas cannot be perceived immediately, the mind can sometimes establish their connection through a series of intermediate steps, each of which is intuitively certain. Geometric proofs exemplify this process by showing how complex theorems follow necessarily from simple axioms through chains of reasoning where each link is obvious once it is pointed out. The conclusion of a valid demonstration is just as certain as intuitive knowledge because it rests ultimately on intuitive perceptions of the relationships between ideas. However, demonstrative knowledge requires more mental effort and creates more opportunities for error because mistakes can occur at any step in a long chain of reasoning. Complex proofs must be checked carefully to ensure that no invalid inferences have been made and no crucial steps have been omitted. Sensitive knowledge concerns the existence of particular external objects that correspond to our sensory ideas, and it represents a lower but still practically adequate degree of certainty. When you look at a tree, you have sensitive knowledge that an actual tree exists outside your mind and causes the visual experiences you are having. This knowledge is less certain than intuitive or demonstrative knowledge because it depends on the reliability of your senses and the assumption that external objects actually exist rather than being mere illusions or dreams. However, Locke argued that sensitive knowledge provides sufficient certainty for practical purposes, even though it cannot achieve the absolute certainty of mathematical demonstration. The consistent patterns in sensory experience, the involuntary nature of most sensations, and the way different senses confirm each other all provide reasonable evidence that we are interacting with a real external world rather than experiencing pure fantasy. Perfect certainty may be impossible, but reasonable confidence is achievable and adequate for guiding action. Below these 3 degrees of knowledge lies probability, which covers beliefs about matters that cannot be established with complete certainty but can be supported with varying degrees of evidence. Most of our beliefs about history, science, other people's thoughts and feelings, and future events fall into this category because they involve inferences from incomplete information rather than direct perception or logical demonstration. Probabilistic reasoning requires carefully weighing evidence, considering alternative explanations, and proportioning belief to the strength of available support rather than accepting or rejecting claims categorically. Some probable beliefs are much more reasonable than others, depending on the quantity and quality of evidence available to support them. Scientific theories, eyewitness testimony, and predictions based on past patterns all provide probabilistic knowledge that can be very reliable without being absolutely certain. The key is to avoid treating probable beliefs as if they were certain knowledge, while also avoiding the opposite error of treating them as if they were mere guesses with no rational foundation. This epistemological framework has profound implications for how people should approach learning and belief formation in different domains of inquiry. In mathematics and logic, where intuitive and demonstrative knowledge are possible, people should expect and demand rigorous proof before accepting conclusions. Mere probability or plausibility is not sufficient when certainty can be achieved through careful reasoning from self-evident principles. In empirical sciences, where sensitive knowledge and probability are the highest attainable degrees of certainty, people should base their beliefs on systematic observation and experimental evidence rather than pure speculation or appeal to authority. In practical affairs, where decisions must be made despite incomplete information, people should gather the best available evidence, consider multiple perspectives, and remain open to revising their beliefs as new information becomes available. Different types of questions require different standards of evidence and different degrees of confidence in our answers. Locke's analysis also reveals important limits to human knowledge that should promote intellectual humility and tolerance for disagreement. Many questions that seem important to human life cannot be answered with certainty because they go beyond the bounds of what empirical observation and logical demonstration can establish. Questions about the ultimate nature of material substances, the precise mechanisms by which minds interact with bodies, and the detailed structure of divine reality exceed the cognitive capacities that finite human beings possess. Recognizing these limits can prevent wasteful disputes about unanswerable questions while directing intellectual energy toward problems where progress is actually possible. It can also reduce the dogmatism and intolerance that arise when people mistake their probable opinions for certain knowledge and demand that others accept their beliefs without adequate evidence. Intellectual humility about the limits of human knowledge creates space for legitimate disagreement and ongoing inquiry rather than premature closure on complex issues. The practical application of these epistemological principles requires developing what Locke called the conduct of the understanding, which involves learning to use our cognitive abilities effectively and avoiding common sources of error in reasoning. This includes learning to distinguish between different types of evidence, to recognize when our beliefs go beyond what our evidence actually supports, and to proportionate our confidence to the strength of our reasons. It also involves cultivating intellectual virtues like curiosity, patience, fair-mindedness, and willingness to change our minds when presented with better evidence or arguments. These skills and dispositions are not automatically acquired, but must be developed through practice and reflection, much like moral virtues must be cultivated through repeated good actions. The goal is to become the kind of person who seeks truth effectively and holds beliefs responsibly rather than simply accumulating information or winning arguments. Good thinking is both an intellectual skill and a moral responsibility that affects not only our own flourishing, but also our ability to contribute positively to shared human knowledge and social cooperation. Part 12. Language, Words and the Communication of Ideas. The relationship between thought and language presented Locke with a fundamental puzzle about how human communication is possible. If all knowledge consists of ideas in individual minds, and if each person's ideas are private mental contents that others cannot directly observe, how can people ever successfully communicate their thoughts to each other? Words are merely arbitrary sounds or marks that have no natural connection to the ideas they are supposed to represent. Yet somehow humans manage to share complex information and coordinate their activities through linguistic exchange. Locke's analysis of language became one of the most influential theories in the philosophy of language and continues to shape debates about meaning, reference, and communication today. Locke argued that words function as signs of ideas, with each word serving as an external marker that speakers use to indicate particular ideas in their minds to other people. When someone says dog, they are using that sound to point toward their mental idea of dogs, hoping that listeners will connect the same sound with similar ideas in their own minds. This process works because people in the same linguistic community have learned to associate the same words with roughly the same ideas through shared experience and social convention. Children acquire language by observing which words adults use in which circumstances and gradually learning to connect those verbal sounds with appropriate ideas derived from their own sensory experiences. Over time, a community develops a shared vocabulary where most people associate most words with sufficiently similar ideas that communication becomes possible despite the fact that no one can directly observe anyone else's mental contents. Language is fundamentally a social institution that requires coordination and cooperation among many individuals over extended periods of time. However, this process of linguistic coordination faces several serious obstacles that can prevent successful communication, even among people who speak the same language fluently. The first major problem is that people often have different ideas associated with the same words because their experiences have been different. Someone who grew up in the city may associate the word farm with very different ideas than someone who grew up in rural areas, leading to misunderstandings when they try to discuss agricultural topics. Similarly, people from different social classes, professions, or cultural backgrounds may use familiar words like justice, freedom, or success, while meaning quite different things by them. These semantic differences can cause serious conflicts when people think they are disagreeing about facts when they are actually using key terms to express different concepts. Many philosophical and political disputes result from terminological confusion rather than genuine disagreement about the underlying realities being discussed. The second major problem is that people often use words without having clear, consistent ideas associated with them at all. Abstract terms like substance, essence, quality, and relation are frequently employed in contexts where speakers cannot specify exactly what ideas these words are supposed to represent. This leads to empty verbal disputes, where people argue about nothing more than different ways of combining meaningless sounds rather than examining real disagreements about observable phenomena. Traditional philosophy, according to Locke, was particularly prone to this type of confusion because philosophers had developed elaborate technical vocabularies without ensuring that their specialized terms corresponded to genuine ideas derived from experience. Debates about substantial forms, occult qualities, and metaphysical essences were largely meaningless because no clear empirical ideas could be associated with the key terms being used. Clarity in language requires clarity in thought, which in turn requires tracing all terms back to the sensory and reflective experiences from which genuine ideas originate. The third major problem is that language inevitably involves abstraction and generalization in ways that can distort our understanding of particular realities. General words like dog, tree, or human refer to abstract ideas that are formed by ignoring the differences between particular individuals and focusing only on their similarities. This abstraction process is necessary for efficient communication because we could not have separate words for every individual thing in the world, but it can also lead us to think that abstract universals exist as real entities rather than as mental constructions we create for practical purposes. When philosophers argue about the nature of humanity in general, rather than studying particular humans in specific circumstances, they may be mistaking useful abstractions for ultimate realities. Language naturally encourages this kind of confusion because it is much easier to use general terms than to specify all the particular details that distinguish one individual from another. Good thinking requires remembering that abstract ideas are tools for organizing experience rather than perfect representations of how the world is actually structured. Locke's analysis suggested several practical recommendations for improving the clarity and effectiveness of human communication. First, people should try to ensure that their words correspond to clear, distinct ideas rather than using terms that sound impressive but lack definite meaning. When introducing new concepts or using familiar words in specialized contexts, speakers should explain what ideas they intend those words to represent, rather than assuming that everyone will understand them the same way. Second, people should be willing to define their terms and examine whether their ideas are actually consistent and well-founded, rather than simply relying on traditional ways of speaking. Third, people should remember that words are human inventions designed to serve practical communication purposes rather than natural categories that reveal the essential structure of reality itself. Fourth, people should be patient with misunderstandings and willing to clarify their meaning rather than assuming that communication failures necessarily indicate disagreement about substantive issues. Many apparent conflicts can be resolved simply by ensuring that everyone is using key terms to express the same ideas. Good communication requires both clarity about our own thoughts and charity in interpreting others' attempts to express their thoughts to us. These principles have important implications for education, science, and public discourse in general. Teachers should help students develop precise vocabularies connected to clear, experiential ideas, rather than simply memorizing definitions of technical terms they do not really understand. Scientists should define their theoretical concepts operationally in terms of observable procedures and measurable results, rather than relying on metaphysical speculations about unobservable essences. Political leaders and citizens should try to clarify what they mean by contested terms like democracy, rights, and equality, rather than assuming that everyone shares the same understanding of these important concepts. Legal systems should strive for precision in the language of laws and contracts to minimize ambiguity about what behaviors are required or prohibited. And philosophers should resist the temptation to multiply abstract entities and technical distinctions unless these intellectual constructions clearly contribute to better understanding of empirical phenomena. Language is a powerful tool for organizing and sharing human knowledge, but it requires careful use to achieve its proper purposes rather than creating additional confusion. The goal should always be clearer thinking and more effective communication rather than impressive sounding but ultimately empty verbal formulations. Part 13. The conduct of the understanding and intellectual virtue. Beyond his formal epistemological theories, Locke developed practical advice about how people can improve their thinking and avoid common intellectual errors that lead to false beliefs and poor decisions. His essay on the conduct of the understanding reads like a manual for intellectual self-improvement, identifying specific mental habits that promote good reasoning and warning against psychological tendencies that distort our judgment. These insights remain remarkably relevant for anyone who wants to think more clearly, learn more effectively, and make better choices in both personal and professional contexts. Locke essentially created the first systematic approach to what we might now call critical thinking skills and intellectual character development. The fundamental principle underlying all of Locke's advice is that good thinking does not happen automatically, but requires deliberate cultivation through practice and reflection. Most people are content to accept whatever beliefs happen to come their way through education, social influence, or casual observation, without examining whether those beliefs are actually well-founded. They treat their minds like passive receptacles that simply collect whatever information they encounter, rather than active instruments that must be trained and directed toward truth through systematic effort. But the human understanding, like any other valuable capacity, develops properly only when it is exercised regularly under appropriate conditions and with conscious attention to improvement. Just as athletes must train their bodies systematically to achieve peak physical performance, thinkers must train their minds systematically to achieve reliable intellectual performance. This requires both learning specific techniques for gathering and evaluating evidence and developing general dispositions that support honest inquiry, rather than mere confirmation of existing prejudices. One of the most common sources of intellectual error, according to Locke, is the tendency to form general conclusions based on limited experience without recognizing how narrow our sample of evidence actually is. Someone who has met a few people from a particular country may form strong opinions about the character of that entire nation based on insufficient data. Someone who has succeeded with a particular approach in their own profession may assume that the same methods will work equally well in completely different contexts. Someone who has lived their entire life in one social environment may treat the customs and values of that environment as universal human nature rather than recognizing them as local variations. These errors result from the natural but misleading tendency to generalize from familiar cases to unfamiliar ones, without carefully considering whether the similarities are genuine and relevant. Good thinking requires consciously expanding our range of experience, actively seeking out counterexamples to our tentative generalizations, and remaining humble about how much we can legitimately infer from limited observation. Another major source of error is the influence of authority, tradition, and social pressure on belief formation. Most people accept many of their most important beliefs simply because those beliefs are endorsed by parents, teachers, religious leaders, political authorities, or peer groups, rather than because they have personally examined the evidence for those beliefs. This creates a kind of intellectual dependency where people become unable to think independently about fundamental questions and instead rely on others to tell them what to believe. While it is obviously impossible and unnecessary for everyone to investigate every belief from scratch, excessive deference to authority can prevent people from recognizing when established opinions are mistaken or when changing circumstances require new approaches to old problems. Good thinking requires learning to distinguish between legitimate expertise that deserves respectful attention and mere assertion of authority that demands uncritical acceptance. It also requires developing the confidence and competence to think for oneself when personal experience conflicts with received wisdom or when authorities disagree among themselves. Locke also identified several emotional and motivational factors that can distort reasoning even when people have access to adequate evidence and proper logical training. Pride and vanity lead people to defend their existing beliefs too stubbornly because admitting error feels like admitting personal inadequacy rather than simply updating their understanding based on new information. Fear and anxiety lead people to avoid investigating questions that might challenge comfortable assumptions or require difficult changes in their lives. Laziness and impatience lead people to accept superficial explanations rather than doing the hard work necessary to understand complex phenomena thoroughly. Party spirit and factional loyalty lead people to evaluate evidence based on whether it supports their preferred group, rather than based on its actual strength and relevance. These emotional obstacles to good thinking cannot be overcome simply by learning formal rules of logic or evidence evaluation, because they operate at a deeper psychological level that affects how those rules are applied in practice. Intellectual improvement therefore requires moral improvement in the form of cultivating virtues like intellectual humility, courage, persistence, and fair-mindedness that support honest inquiry regardless of where it leads. Good thinking is ultimately a matter of character as much as technique. The positive cultivation of good intellectual habits involves several specific practices that anyone can implement regardless of their formal education or professional background. First, people should actively seek out diverse perspectives on important questions rather than limiting themselves to sources that confirm their existing beliefs. This means reading authors who disagree with you, talking to people from different backgrounds and experiences, and seriously considering objections to your own views rather than dismissing them without careful examination. Second, people should practice separating questions about what is true from questions about what they would like to be true or what would be convenient to believe. Personal preferences and practical interests are legitimate considerations in many contexts, but they should not be allowed to influence judgments about factual matters where truth is more important than comfort or convenience. Third, people should regularly examine the foundations of their most important beliefs by tracing them back to the evidence and reasoning that originally supported them. Beliefs that cannot be connected to adequate evidence should be held tentatively or abandoned entirely, rather than being maintained simply because they feel familiar or socially acceptable. Fourth, people should develop the habit of proportioning their confidence to the strength of their evidence rather than believing everything with equal certainty or doubting everything with equal skepticism. Some questions can be answered with high confidence based on extensive, consistent evidence, while others can only be approached tentatively based on limited, conflicting information. Recognizing these differences helps avoid both the overconfidence that leads to dogmatism and the excessive doubt that leads to paralysis. Fifth, people should practice thinking systematically about complex issues by breaking them down into smaller, more manageable components rather than trying to address everything at once. Most important questions involve multiple factors that interact in complicated ways, and good thinking requires patient analysis of how those factors relate to each other, rather than jumping to simple conclusions based on superficial similarities. Sixth, people should cultivate intellectual friendship with others who share their commitment to truth-seeking, rather than limiting their discussions to those who already agree with their conclusions. Collaborative inquiry often produces better results than solitary reflection because other people can notice blind spots, suggest alternative approaches, and provide accountability for maintaining high standards of evidence and reasoning. The goal is to create communities of inquiry where disagreement is welcomed as an opportunity for mutual learning rather than treated as a threat to be defeated. Part 14. Natural Theology and the Rational Foundation of Religious Belief. Despite his emphasis on empirical knowledge and religious toleration, Locke remained a committed Christian throughout his life and devoted considerable effort to showing that core religious beliefs could be supported by rational argument based on natural evidence. His approach to what philosophers call natural theology attempted to demonstrate the existence and basic attributes of God through reason and observation, rather than through appeal to revealed scripture or ecclesiastical authority. This project was motivated partly by intellectual curiosity about ultimate questions and partly by practical concerns about providing a rational foundation for morality and social cooperation in an increasingly diverse and skeptical age. Locke wanted to show that religious belief could be reasonable without being dogmatic, and that faith could be compatible with intellectual honesty and scientific inquiry. Locke's argument for God's existence followed a traditional pattern known as the cosmological argument, but he developed it with characteristic attention to empirical evidence and epistemological rigor. He began with the undeniable fact that he himself exists as a thinking, conscious being with various knowledge and abilities. Since something cannot come from nothing, his existence must have been caused by something else that possessed at least as much reality and perfection as he does. But if that cause were itself caused by something else, then the same reasoning would apply to its cause, creating a chain that must eventually terminate in an uncaused first cause. An infinite regress of causes would be impossible, because it would mean that no actual explanation had been provided for the existence of anything, including the series itself. Therefore, there must be an eternal, self-existent being that serves as the ultimate source of all other existence, and this being is what people call God. Moreover, this first cause must possess intelligence and consciousness because it produced intelligent and conscious effects like human beings. A purely material cause could not produce mental phenomena like thought, knowledge, and moral responsibility because matter in motion can only rearrange itself according to physical laws, but cannot create genuinely new types of reality. The intricate organization and apparent design visible throughout the natural world also suggests that its ultimate cause must be an intelligent agent capable of forming and executing complex plans rather than a blind force operating purely by chance. When we observe the remarkable adaptation of living organisms to their environments, the mathematical regularity of astronomical motions, and the rational intelligibility of natural laws, we see evidence of a supreme intelligence that designed the universe to operate according to coherent principles. The same reasoning we use to infer human intelligence from its products leads us to infer divine intelligence from the products of nature as a whole. Random processes could not produce the systematic order and functional complexity that characterize both individual organisms and the cosmic system within which they exist. Locke also argued that God must be perfectly good and just based on both rational considerations and moral experience. A being with unlimited knowledge and power would have no need to act from ignorance, weakness, or external constraint, which are the usual sources of moral evil in human behavior. Such a being would also have no reason to treat different creatures unfairly, because divine perfection implies complete self-sufficiency, and therefore complete freedom from the partiality and favoritism that result from dependence on particular individuals or groups. The existence of moral conscience in human beings provides additional evidence for divine goodness because it suggests that the source of human nature built ethical sensitivity into the very structure of rational consciousness. If God were evil or indifferent to morality, it would be difficult to explain why humans have such strong intuitions about right and wrong, and why they feel guilt and satisfaction in connection with their moral choices. The fact that moral principles seem to be universal features of human psychology, rather than arbitrary cultural inventions, suggests that they reflect the character of the divine mind that created human nature. However, Locke recognized that natural theology faces serious limitations that prevent it from answering many questions that people would like to have answered about divine matters. Reason can establish that God exists and possesses certain general attributes like intelligence, power, and goodness, but it cannot determine the precise details of divine nature or divine plans for the world. Questions about the Trinity, the Incarnation, the afterlife, and the specific requirements for salvation go beyond what can be demonstrated through philosophical argument based on natural evidence alone. These doctrines may be true, but their truth cannot be established through the same methods that establish the existence of an intelligent first cause. Natural theology provides a foundation for religious belief, but it must be supplemented by other sources of information if people want guidance about how to conduct their religious lives in detail. Reason can show that theism is more plausible than atheism, but it cannot adjudicate between different theistic traditions that agree about God's existence while disagreeing about God's specific attributes and requirements. This analysis led Locke to develop a nuanced position about the relationship between reason and revelation in religious matters. Revealed religion, as contained in scriptures and transmitted through religious traditions, can provide information about divine matters that goes beyond what natural reason can discover independently. However, such revelations must be evaluated using the same rational standards that apply to any other knowledge claims, rather than being accepted automatically simply because they claim divine authority. Purported revelations that contradict clear rational knowledge or well-established empirical evidence should be rejected as spurious regardless of their traditional credentials. Similarly, alleged revelations that contradict moral principles accessible to natural reason should be suspect, because a perfectly good God would not command actions that are genuinely evil or forbid actions that are genuinely virtuous. Reason serves as a critical filter that can distinguish authentic divine communication from human fabrication, superstition, and wishful thinking. At the same time, Locke insisted that genuine revelation can provide valuable information that supplements and enriches what natural reason can discover about religious matters. If God exists and cares about human welfare, it would be reasonable for such a being to communicate with humanity in ways that go beyond what people can figure out for themselves through philosophical reflection. Revelation can provide assurance about questions where natural reason leads only to probability rather than certainty, and it can offer guidance about practical religious obligations that reason alone cannot determine definitively. The key is to ensure that claims about revelation are subjected to appropriate rational scrutiny rather than being accepted or rejected automatically based on prior theological commitments. This approach allows religious belief to remain both intellectually responsible and spiritually meaningful without forcing people to choose between faith and reason, as if they were fundamentally incompatible approaches to truth-seeking. The goal is a mature religious perspective that takes both rational evidence and spiritual experience seriously, while remaining humble about the limits of human understanding in matters that touch on ultimate reality. Part 15. International Relations and the Law of Nations. Locke's political philosophy extended beyond domestic government to questions about how different societies should relate to each other in the absence of any global sovereign authority. His analysis of international relations applied the same principles he used to understand individual human relationships in the state of nature, but with additional complications arising from the collective character of political communities and their legitimate interest in self-preservation and prosperity. This approach became influential in later theories of international law and just war doctrine, though it also revealed tensions between universal moral principles and particular national loyalties that continue to challenge political theorists today. Locke essentially created a framework for thinking about global politics that balanced respect for sovereignty with recognition of universal human rights. In Locke's analysis, independent political communities exist in a state of nature with respect to each other because there is no common superior authority with legitimate power to settle disputes between them. Just as individuals in the original state of nature are free and equal, sovereign nations are free and equal in their relationships with other nations. No country has natural authority over any other country, and all nations have the same basic rights to independence, self-governance, and control over their internal affairs. However, this international state of nature is governed by the same natural law that applies to individual human relationships, which means that nations have obligations to respect each other's rights and to refrain from unjust aggression. National sovereignty is not unlimited license to do whatever a country's leaders choose, but rather a system of reciprocal rights and duties that makes peaceful coexistence possible among diverse political communities. The challenge is to specify what these international obligations require in concrete situations where different nations' legitimate interests conflict with each other. The most basic principle of international natural law is that nations should not harm each other without justification, which prohibits unprovoked attacks, territorial conquest, and interference in other countries' legitimate internal governance. Just as individuals in the state of nature cannot legitimately kill, enslave, or rob other individuals, nations cannot legitimately invade, colonize, or economically exploit other nations simply because they have the power to do so. Might does not make right in international relations any more than it does in individual relationships, and successful conquest does not automatically create legitimate authority over conquered peoples. However, nations do have the right to defend themselves against unjust attack and to seek reparations for injuries they have suffered from other nations' wrongful actions. They also have the right to form alliances and mutual defense agreements that help protect their security against potential aggressors. The goal is to create international conditions that allow different political communities to flourish according to their own values and interests, while respecting the equal rights of other communities to do the same. Wars between nations can be just or unjust depending on their causes and the methods used to conduct them. Defensive wars against unprovoked aggression are clearly justified because nations, like individuals, have the right to protect themselves against unjust attack. Wars to recover stolen territory or to obtain compensation for past injuries may also be justified if peaceful negotiations have failed, and the original wrongdoing was serious enough to warrant the costs and risks of military action. However, wars of conquest aimed at expanding territory or gaining economic advantage are unjust because they violate other nations' rights to independence and self-determination. Similarly, wars fought for purely religious reasons to force other peoples to convert to particular beliefs are unjust because they exceed the proper scope of governmental authority and violate principles of religious toleration. The decision to go to war should be made only when the expected benefits clearly outweigh the expected costs, and when less destructive alternatives have been tried without success. Even in just wars, the methods used to achieve military objectives must respect moral limits that protect innocent people from unnecessary harm. Soldiers engaged in combat are legitimate targets because they have chosen to participate in violent conflict, but civilians who are not directly contributing to the war effort should be protected from deliberate attack. Property that is not being used for military purposes should not be destroyed simply to inflict economic damage on the enemy population. Prisoners of war should be treated humanely because they are no longer active combatants and pose no immediate threat to their captors. The goal of just war is to restore peace and justice, not to inflict maximum suffering on the opposing side or to eliminate them as competitors. These principles reflect the insight that war is a regrettable necessity, sometimes required to protect important rights and interests, not an opportunity for unlimited violence against anyone who happens to be on the opposing side. Questions about trade, immigration, and economic cooperation between nations present additional challenges that require balancing legitimate national interests with respect for universal human rights. Countries have legitimate interests in controlling their borders, protecting their domestic industries, and maintaining their cultural identities. But these interests must be pursued in ways that do not violate other people's basic rights to life and liberty. Wealthy nations cannot simply ignore the poverty and suffering that exist in other parts of the world, especially when their own prosperity has been built partly through historical relationships with those regions. At the same time, no country can be required to sacrifice the welfare of its own citizens for the sake of helping foreigners, and attempts to redistribute wealth globally through coercive means would violate the same principles of consent and limited government that apply domestically. The challenge is to develop forms of international cooperation that serve everyone's long-term interests while respecting everyone's rights to make their own choices about how to organize their economic and social institutions. This requires creative approaches that go beyond both isolationist nationalism and coercive internationalism to find mutually beneficial arrangements that different peoples can voluntarily accept. Locke's analysis of international relations also addressed the difficult question of how civilized nations should deal with peoples who live in different social and economic systems. He argued that differences in technology, economic organization, and cultural practices do not justify treating other peoples as inferior or denying them the basic rights that all humans possess by nature. However, he also believed that more economically developed societies had legitimate interest in using unoccupied land more productively than hunting and gathering peoples typically did. This created tensions between universal human equality and particular forms of property rights that reflected the colonial context of his era more than the logical implications of his general principles. Later thinkers would use Locke's own arguments about natural rights and consent to criticize colonial practices that he had not adequately challenged, showing how philosophical principles can have implications that their original advocates did not fully appreciate. The ongoing challenge is to apply universal moral principles consistently across cultural differences without imposing particular institutional arrangements on peoples who have legitimate reasons to prefer alternative approaches to organizing their societies. Part 16. Moral Philosophy and the Foundation of Ethics. While Locke is best known for his political and epistemological theories, he also made important contributions to moral philosophy by attempting to ground ethical principles in the same empirical approach he applied to other areas of human knowledge. His moral theory sought to show that principles of right and wrong could be discovered through careful reasoning about human nature and the conditions necessary for human flourishing, rather than being accepted on faith or derived from arbitrary commands. This naturalistic approach to ethics would influence later moral philosophers and continues to shape contemporary debates about the relationship between facts and values in ethical reasoning. Locke essentially tried to develop a scientific approach to morality that could provide objective guidance for human conduct while respecting individual freedom and cultural diversity. The foundation of Locke's moral theory lies in his understanding of human nature as created by God for specific purposes that can be discovered through empirical observation and rational reflection. Humans are social beings who depend on cooperation with others for their survival, security and prosperity, which means that moral principles must facilitate rather than undermine the social relationships that make human life possible. They are also rational beings, capable of understanding general principles and applying them to particular situations, which means that moral rules must be intelligible and consistent rather than arbitrary or contradictory. And they are finite beings with limited knowledge and power who make mistakes and face temptations, which means that moral expectations must be realistic rather than demanding impossible perfection. Any adequate moral theory must take account of what humans actually are, rather than what we might wish them to be, or what they might become under idealized conditions that never actually exist. Ethics must be grounded in psychological and social reality if it is to provide practical guidance for real people facing genuine choices in complex situations. Natural law provides the basic framework within which more specific moral principles can be developed through careful reasoning about particular types of human relationships and activities. The fundamental principle that humans should preserve themselves and others establishes a general presumption in favor of actions that promote life, health, knowledge, and happiness, while creating a general presumption against actions that cause death, suffering, ignorance, or misery. However, applying this general principle to specific cases requires detailed analysis of consequences, consideration of alternative approaches, and careful attention to the rights and interests of everyone who might be affected by our choices. Moral reasoning is not simply a matter of following predetermined rules, but rather an ongoing process of practical judgment that must consider all relevant factors in their particular contexts. Different situations may require different responses, even when the same general principles apply, because the specific ways of promoting human welfare vary, depending on circumstances, relationships, and available alternatives. Good moral judgment requires both commitment to universal principles and sensitivity to particular details that affect how those principles should be implemented. The relationship between individual self-interest and moral obligation presents one of the most challenging problems in any ethical theory. Locke recognized that people naturally care more about their own welfare than about the welfare of strangers, and that any moral system which ignored this psychological reality would be ineffective in guiding actual human behavior. At the same time, he insisted that genuine morality requires some degree of impartial concern for others' rights and interests, rather than pure selfishness that treats other people merely as means to our own ends. His solution emphasized the long-term convergence between individual and social interests, rather than demanding that people sacrifice their own good for the sake of others. A society organized according to just principles will generally reward virtue and punish vice in ways that make moral behavior advantageous, even from a purely self-interested perspective. Moreover, humans are naturally social beings who find meaning and satisfaction in relationships with others, which means that contributing to the common good can be personally fulfilling rather than merely burdensome. The apparent conflict between morality and self-interest often results from short-sighted thinking that fails to consider the full consequences of our actions for our own long-term welfare as well as for others. Enlightened self-interest and genuine moral concern point in the same direction more often than they conflict with each other. Religious considerations play an important but complex role in Locke's moral theory. He believed that natural law derives ultimately from God's will, and that divine rewards and punishments in an afterlife provide additional motivation for moral behavior beyond the natural consequences that follow from our actions in this world. This religious framework helps explain why moral principles are objectively binding, rather than merely matters of personal preference or social convention. And it provides assurance that justice will ultimately prevail even when evil seems to triumph temporarily. However, Locke insisted that the content of moral principles can be discovered through natural reason rather than requiring special revelation, which means that religious and non-religious people can agree about most ethical questions despite their theological differences. The practical requirements of morality are accessible to anyone who carefully studies human nature and social relationships, regardless of their particular religious beliefs or lack thereof. This approach allows for moral discourse and cooperation across religious boundaries, while maintaining that ethical principles have an objective foundation that transcends mere human opinion or cultural tradition. The practical application of moral principles requires developing various intellectual and emotional capacities that enable good judgment in complex situations where simple rules provide insufficient guidance. Moral wisdom involves understanding how general principles apply to particular cases, which requires extensive experience with different types of situations and relationships, as well as careful reflection on the consequences of different approaches to similar problems. It also involves cultivating emotional responses that support rather than undermine good judgment, such as sympathy for others' suffering, satisfaction from contributing to their welfare, and appropriate guilt when we fail to meet our moral obligations. These emotional capacities are not automatic, but must be developed through practice and social learning, much like intellectual skills must be cultivated through education and experience. Moral education should therefore focus on habituating appropriate emotional responses as well as teaching rational principles, because effective moral action requires both understanding what we should do and being motivated to actually do it consistently. The goal is to develop what Aristotle called practical wisdom, which combines intellectual understanding with emotional maturity and practical experience in ways that enable reliable moral judgment across diverse circumstances. Locke's approach to moral philosophy also addresses questions about the relationship between individual conscience and social institutions in determining ethical obligations. Each person has both the right and the responsibility to think carefully about moral questions and to act according to their best judgment about what is right, even when their conclusions conflict with popular opinion or established authority. Blind obedience to external commands without personal moral reflection is inconsistent with the rational nature that makes humans capable of ethical behavior in the first place. However, individual moral judgment is fallible and must be exercised within social institutions that provide feedback, accountability, and collective wisdom about the likely consequences of different choices. The goal is neither uncritical conformity to social expectations nor isolated individualism that ignores others' legitimate interests and insights, but rather a mature moral autonomy that takes personal responsibility for ethical choices while remaining open to learning from social experience and moral traditions. This requires developing the intellectual humility to recognize our own limitations while maintaining the moral courage to act according to our best understanding of what genuine human flourishing requires. Part 17. Skepticism, Certainty and the Limits of Human Knowledge. One of the most sophisticated aspects of Locke's philosophy was his careful navigation between excessive skepticism that doubts everything and naive dogmatism that questions nothing. He recognized that both extreme positions were intellectually and practically inadequate, but developing a middle path required detailed analysis of what kinds of knowledge are possible for finite human beings and what kinds of questions lie beyond the reach of human cognitive abilities. This epistemological modesty became a hallmark of Enlightenment thinking and continues to influence contemporary debates about the scope and limits of rational inquiry. Locke essentially created a framework for intellectual humility that acknowledges genuine uncertainties without abandoning the possibility of reliable knowledge. Ancient skeptical arguments had challenged the possibility of certain knowledge by pointing out that our senses sometimes deceive us, our reasoning sometimes leads to contradictory conclusions, and our most confident beliefs sometimes turn out to be mistaken. If we cannot always distinguish between true and false beliefs when we hold them, skeptics argued, then we can never be genuinely certain about anything and should therefore suspend judgment on all questions rather than risk accepting falsehoods as truths. This skeptical position had the advantage of protecting people from error by preventing them from making unjustified knowledge claims, but it also had the serious disadvantage of making practical decision-making impossible because action requires some beliefs about how the world works and what consequences different choices are likely to produce. Complete skepticism is self-refuting because even the decision to suspend judgment presupposes beliefs about the unreliability of human cognitive abilities and the desirability of avoiding error. Dogmatic responses to skepticism typically involved claiming that certain sources of knowledge are infallible and can therefore provide absolutely certain foundations for all other beliefs. Rationalist philosophers often treated mathematical reasoning or metaphysical intuition as sources of indubitable knowledge that could serve as starting points for deducing other truths with complete confidence. Religious thinkers often treated scriptural revelation or ecclesiastical authority as infallible guides that could provide certain answers to any questions they addressed. But Locke's empirical investigation of human understanding showed that all our cognitive abilities are fallible, and that all our beliefs are based ultimately on sensory experiences and mental operations that can sometimes mislead us. Even mathematical reasoning depends on the accuracy of our perceptions of symbols and our memory of previous steps in complex calculations, both of which are potentially unreliable. The search for absolutely certain foundations appears to be hopeless because all human knowledge rests ultimately on cognitive processes that are less than perfectly reliable. Locke's alternative approach involved distinguishing between different degrees of certainty and different standards of evidence appropriate to different types of questions. Some beliefs can be established with very high confidence based on extensive, consistent, and carefully tested evidence, even if they cannot achieve the absolute certainty that mathematical proof seems to provide. Other beliefs can be supported with sufficient probability to guide practical action, even if they fall short of the high confidence that well-established scientific theories deserve. Still, other beliefs may be plausible enough to be worth considering, but not strong enough to justify confident conclusions or significant practical commitments. The key insight is that different situations require different levels of certainty, and that it is often reasonable to act on probable beliefs rather than waiting for complete certainty that may never be available. Perfect knowledge is not necessary for effective action, and the demand for absolute certainty can be just as paralyzing as complete skepticism if it prevents us from making reasonable decisions based on the best available evidence. This graduated approach to certainty requires developing practical wisdom about when to seek more evidence and when to act on the information already available. In matters of life and death, it may be worth investing considerable time and effort to gather additional information before making decisions because the stakes are so high. In routine daily activities, it may be reasonable to act on relatively little evidence because the consequences of being wrong are minor, and the costs of further investigation would outweigh any likely benefits. In intellectual inquiry, it may be appropriate to hold beliefs tentatively while continuing to gather evidence that might confirm or disconfirm them rather than rushing to premature conclusions or avoiding conclusions altogether. The goal is to calibrate our confidence appropriately to the strength of our evidence while remaining open to revision when new information becomes available. This requires both intellectual courage to form beliefs and make decisions despite uncertainty, and intellectual humility to acknowledge the limitations of our knowledge and the possibility that we might be mistaken. Locke identified several specific areas where human knowledge faces inherent limitations that should promote intellectual modesty and tolerance for disagreement. Questions about the ultimate nature of material substances go beyond what sensory experience can reveal because we can observe only the effects that substances produce in us rather than their intrinsic properties. Questions about the precise mechanisms by which minds and bodies interact exceed our cognitive abilities because consciousness seems to involve something beyond purely physical processes that we cannot directly observe or measure. Questions about the detailed structure of divine reality surpass human understanding because an infinite being necessarily transcends the comprehension of finite creatures. These limitations do not make such questions meaningless or unimportant, but they do suggest that we should be modest about our ability to answer them definitively and tolerant of others who reach different conclusions based on the same limited evidence. Recognizing the bounds of human knowledge can prevent dogmatic disputes about unanswerable questions while preserving intellectual energy for problems where progress is actually possible. The practical implications of epistemological modesty extend beyond academic philosophy to questions about education, science, religion, and politics. Educational institutions should teach students to think critically about knowledge claims rather than simply memorizing authoritative answers to complex questions. Scientific research should remain open to revising established theories when new evidence emerges rather than treating current understanding as final and unchangeable truth. Religious communities should focus on core beliefs that can be established with reasonable confidence rather than demanding detailed agreement about matters that lie beyond human comprehension. Political systems should provide procedures for peaceful revision of laws and policies, rather than assuming that any particular set of arrangements represents the permanent solution to social problems. In all these areas, intellectual humility about the limits of human knowledge can promote more effective learning, more honest inquiry, and more tolerant cooperation among people who disagree about important but difficult questions. The goal is neither skeptical paralysis nor dogmatic rigidity, but rather a mature intellectual stance that takes both our cognitive abilities and their limitations seriously, while remaining committed to the ongoing pursuit of truth and human flourishing. Part 18. Scientific Method and the New Philosophy of Nature. Locke's empirical philosophy played a crucial role in the scientific revolution that transformed human understanding of the natural world during the 17th and 18th centuries. His emphasis on observation, experimentation, and inductive reasoning provided philosophical justification for the new scientific methods that were replacing traditional approaches based on ancient authorities and speculative reasoning. By showing how all knowledge derives from sensory experience and reflection, Locke helped establish empirical investigation as the most reliable path to understanding natural phenomena. His influence on scientific thinking extended far beyond his explicit writings about natural philosophy to shape the entire intellectual framework within which modern science developed. Traditional natural philosophy, as practiced in medieval universities, relied heavily on the works of Aristotle and other ancient authorities, who had developed comprehensive theories about the natural world through purely rational speculation. Students learned to explain natural phenomena by appealing to formal causes, final causes, and essential natures that were supposed to be discoverable through logical analysis of concepts, rather than empirical investigation of particular events. This approach produced elaborate theoretical systems that seemed intellectually satisfying but often failed to predict or control natural phenomena in ways that could be practically useful. When observations conflicted with established theories, scholars typically tried to save the theories by developing complex explanations for why the observations might be misleading rather than revising the theories to accommodate new evidence. The result was a form of natural philosophy that was more concerned with maintaining conceptual consistency than with accurately describing how the world actually works. Locke's empiricism provided a philosophical foundation for rejecting this approach in favor of methods that prioritized observational evidence over theoretical elegance. The new experimental philosophy, championed by figures like Francis Bacon, Robert Boyle, and Isaac Newton, emphasized careful observation of natural phenomena under controlled conditions designed to test specific hypotheses about causal relationships. Instead of trying to deduce the properties of natural substances from abstract definitions, investigators performed experiments to discover what those substances actually do when placed in various circumstances. Instead of assuming that natural phenomena must conform to preconceived ideas about cosmic harmony or divine purposes, researchers tried to discover the actual patterns and regularities that could be observed in natural processes. This approach required developing new standards of evidence, new methods of measurement, and new ways of reasoning from particular observations to general conclusions. Locke's analysis of how ideas are formed from sensory experience provided the epistemological framework needed to justify these methodological innovations and to explain why they were more likely to produce reliable knowledge than traditional approaches. His account of human understanding showed that empirical investigation was not merely one possible approach to natural philosophy, but rather the only approach that was consistent with how human knowledge actually develops. Locke's distinction between primary and secondary qualities became particularly important for understanding what scientific investigation could and could not reveal about the nature of material reality. Primary qualities like shape, size, motion and number exist in objects themselves and can be measured objectively using mathematical methods that produce consistent results across different observers. Secondary qualities like color, taste, smell and sound exist only in the interactions between objects and conscious observers, so they cannot be studied using purely objective methods that ignore the subjective experiences of particular individuals. This distinction helped clarify why mathematical physics was so successful at describing certain aspects of natural phenomena, while remaining largely silent about other aspects that seem equally real to everyday experience. It also helped explain why scientific knowledge could be objective and universal, despite being based ultimately on the subjective experiences of individual observers. By focusing on primary qualities that exist independently of human consciousness, science could discover truths about the natural world that would hold for any rational observer, rather than being limited to particular perspectives or cultural contexts. However, Locke also recognized important limitations in what empirical science could achieve, which led him to advocate intellectual modesty about the scope of scientific knowledge. While observation and experimentation could reveal reliable patterns in natural phenomena and enable successful predictions and practical applications, they could not penetrate to the ultimate essences or intrinsic natures of material substances. Science could discover what natural objects do under various conditions, but it could not explain why they have the particular powers and properties they exhibit, rather than some other possible set of characteristics. These limitations were not temporary obstacles that would eventually be overcome through better instruments or more sophisticated theories, but rather permanent features of the relationship between finite human minds and the infinite complexity of natural reality. Recognizing these bounds of scientific understanding could prevent the kind of overconfident materialism that treated current scientific theories as complete and final truths, while also preserving appropriate respect for the genuine achievements that empirical investigation had made possible. Science was enormously valuable within its proper domain, but it was not the only legitimate source of human knowledge, and should not be expected to answer every important question about reality and human experience. Locke's influence on scientific thinking extended beyond methodology to questions about the social organization of scientific research and the relationship between scientific knowledge and public policy. His emphasis on individual judgment and intellectual freedom suggested that scientific progress required protecting researchers from political and religious authorities who might try to suppress inconvenient discoveries. His arguments for religious toleration implied that scientific conclusions should be evaluated on their empirical merits rather than their theological implications, because natural and revealed knowledge addressed different types of questions that should not be allowed to interfere with each other. His democratic political theory suggested that scientific institutions should be organized to promote open inquiry and free exchange of ideas, rather than authoritarian control by established experts who might resist innovative approaches. These insights helped create the intellectual and institutional conditions necessary for the flourishing of modern science as a cooperative enterprise involving many investigators working together to build cumulative knowledge about natural phenomena. The scientific revolution was not merely a change in theories about the natural world, but also a transformation in social practices and institutions that made sustained empirical investigation possible on a large scale. The practical applications of scientific knowledge raised additional questions about the relationship between empirical understanding and human values that Locke's philosophy helped illuminate. Scientific discoveries could provide powerful tools for achieving human purposes, but they could not by themselves determine what those purposes should be or how the new capabilities they created should be used responsibly. The same knowledge that enabled beneficial medical treatments could also be used to develop more effective weapons, and the same technological innovations that increased material prosperity could also create new forms of environmental and social problems. Locke's moral philosophy provided resources for thinking about these ethical dimensions of scientific progress by emphasizing that empirical knowledge should serve human flourishing rather than being pursued as an end in itself. The ultimate justification for scientific research lay in its contributions to life, liberty, health and happiness, rather than in mere intellectual curiosity or technical virtuosity. This instrumental understanding of science helped establish expectations that scientific institutions should be accountable to broader social values while remaining free from inappropriate political interference in their methods of inquiry. The challenge was to maintain both the intellectual autonomy necessary for effective research and the social responsibility necessary for ensuring that scientific knowledge served the common good rather than merely the interests of researchers or their immediate patrons. Part 19. Legacy and historical influence across centuries. The intellectual earthquake that John Locke created in the late 17th century continued to reshape human thought and institutions for centuries after his death. His ideas became the philosophical DNA of the modern democratic world, influencing not only political revolutionaries and constitutional framers, but also educational reformers, economic theorists, and social movements that sought to expand human freedom and equality. Tracing the historical trajectory of Lockean influence reveals both the remarkable power of philosophical ideas to transform societies and the complex ways that those ideas evolve as they encounter new circumstances and challenges. Understanding this legacy helps explain how the intellectual work of a single individual can continue to shape human experience across vastly different historical contexts. The most immediate and dramatic impact of Locke's political philosophy appeared in the American Revolution and the founding of the United States as a constitutional republic based on popular consent and individual rights. Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence read like a practical application of Locke's social contract theory, arguing that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed and that people have the right to alter or abolish governments that become destructive of their natural rights. The Constitution's system of separated powers with checks and balances directly implemented Locke's recommendations for preventing tyranny through institutional design. The Bill of Rights protected many of the individual liberties that Locke had argued were beyond government's legitimate authority to restrict, including freedom of religion, speech, press and assembly. Even the federal structure of American government reflected Lockean insights about the need to limit political power and maintain accountability to local communities. The founders treated Locke not as one thinker among many, but as the philosopher who had best captured the principles that should guide free societies. The French Revolution initially drew similar inspiration from Locke's ideas about natural rights and popular sovereignty, though it also revealed some of the tensions and ambiguities in his political theory. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen proclaimed universal principles of liberty, equality and fraternity that echoed Lockean themes while extending them beyond the relatively narrow conception of political participation that Locke himself had envisioned. However, the revolutionary process also demonstrated how difficult it could be to establish stable institutions based on abstract principles, especially when existing social and economic structures created obstacles to genuine equality of opportunity. The emergence of radical democracy and eventually Napoleonic dictatorship showed that popular sovereignty could be interpreted in ways that threatened rather than protected individual liberty. These experiences forced later democratic theorists to think more carefully about the institutional requirements for making Lockean principles work effectively in practice, rather than simply assuming that good intentions and correct principles would automatically produce good results. The French Revolution's complex legacy illustrated both the inspirational power and the practical limitations of Locke's political philosophy. 19th-century liberal movements throughout Europe and Latin America continued to draw on Lockean ideas while adapting them to different national circumstances and cultural contexts. Constitutional monarchies emerged in many countries as compromises between traditional authority and modern democratic principles, often incorporating Lockean insights about separation of powers and individual rights, while preserving ceremonial roles for hereditary rulers. Independence movements in Latin America explicitly invoked natural rights arguments to justify their separation from colonial powers, though they often struggled to establish stable democratic institutions in societies with deep economic inequalities and limited experience with self-government. Liberal political parties across Europe championed free trade, religious toleration, and constitutional government as practical applications of Lockean philosophy to industrial societies that were very different from the agricultural England of Locke's own era. These varied historical experiences showed both the adaptability and the limits of Locke's ideas as guides for political action in diverse circumstances. Universal principles required contextual interpretation and institutional innovation to become effective in particular times and places. The abolition of slavery presented a crucial test of whether Lockean principles would be applied consistently to all human beings or limited to particular groups based on race, ethnicity, or cultural background. Locke himself had not fully extended his theories of natural equality and individual rights to enslaved Africans, reflecting the limitations of his historical context and perhaps his personal economic interests. However, later anti-slavery activists used Locke's own arguments about natural rights and the illegitimacy of arbitrary power to demonstrate that slavery was inconsistent with the fundamental principles of legitimate government. If all humans are created equal and possess natural rights to life, liberty and property, then enslaving some people for the benefit of others violated the most basic requirements of justice regardless of what positive laws or social customs might permit. The anti-slavery movement showed how philosophical principles could have implications that their original advocates had not fully recognized or accepted, and how moral progress often involved extending established principles more consistently rather than discovering entirely new ones. This pattern would be repeated in later movements for women's rights, civil rights, and other forms of social equality that used Lockean arguments to challenge various forms of discrimination and exclusion. The development of modern capitalism and industrial society created new questions about how Locke's property theory should be interpreted and applied in economic systems very different from the agricultural context he had originally analysed. His labour theory of property seemed to support individual entrepreneurship and market exchange, but it was less clear how it applied to large corporations, inherited wealth, and complex financial instruments that bore little resemblance to simple farming or craftsmanship. Socialist and communist critics argued that Lockean principles actually supported workers' claims to control the means of production rather than capitalist ownership of productive resources that workers operated but did not own. Liberal defenders of market systems argued that voluntary exchange and economic freedom represented the natural extension of Lockean ideas about individual liberty and limited government into the economic sphere. These debates showed how the same philosophical principles could be interpreted in different ways, depending on how they were applied to changed historical circumstances and what aspects of the original theory were emphasized or de-emphasized. Locke's economic ideas remained influential, but their practical implications continued to be contested as economic systems evolved in directions he had not anticipated. 20th century challenges to liberal democracy, including fascism, communism, and various forms of authoritarianism, forced renewed examination of whether Lockean principles were adequate for modern political life. Critics argued that his individualistic assumptions ignored the importance of community, tradition, and collective identity in human life, and that his emphasis on negative rights failed to address positive obligations to ensure that all citizens had genuine opportunities to participate meaningfully in social and economic life. Defenders responded that alternatives to liberal democracy had proven even more problematic in practice, and that Lockean principles provided the best available framework for protecting human dignity while allowing for peaceful change and social progress. The rise of totalitarian regimes that claim to represent popular will while systematically violating individual rights seem to confirm Locke's warnings about the dangers of unlimited political power, regardless of its democratic credentials. However, the persistence of economic inequality and social exclusion in liberal societies also showed that formal political equality was insufficient to guarantee genuine freedom and opportunity for all citizens. These experiences led to various attempts to supplement Lockean liberalism with additional principles and institutions while preserving its core insights about limited government and individual rights. Contemporary political movements around the world continue to invoke Lockean themes while adapting them to current challenges like globalization, environmental degradation, technological change, and cultural diversity. Human rights advocacy draws heavily on natural rights arguments to challenge oppressive governments and to establish international standards for political legitimacy. Democratic transitions in formerly authoritarian countries often explicitly reference social contract theory and popular sovereignty as justifications for new constitutional arrangements. Debates about economic inequality, environmental protection, and technological regulation frequently involve competing interpretations of how Lockean principles should be applied to contemporary problems that he could not have foreseen. The enduring influence of his ideas demonstrates their continued relevance while also highlighting the need for ongoing interpretation and development as human societies continue to evolve. Locke's legacy lies not in providing final answers to political questions, but in establishing a framework for thinking about those questions that respects both human dignity and practical effectiveness in the ongoing project of creating better forms of social organization. Part 20. Contemporary Critiques and the Future of Lockean Philosophy. 3 centuries after Locke's death, his philosophical system faces sophisticated criticisms from multiple directions that challenge both his specific theories and his underlying assumptions about human nature, knowledge, and social organization. These contemporary critiques do not simply reject his ideas, but rather engage with them seriously enough to identify their limitations and propose alternatives or modifications that might better serve human flourishing in today's world. Understanding these criticisms is essential for evaluating what remains valuable in Locke's philosophy, and what might need to be revised or supplemented to address the challenges of the 21st century. The ongoing vitality of debates about Lockean themes demonstrates their continued importance while also revealing areas where further philosophical work is needed. Feminist philosophers have raised fundamental questions about whether Locke's political theory can adequately address issues of gender equality and family relationships. His social contract theory assumes that individuals enter political society as independent agents capable of making binding agreements, but this assumption ignores the reality that many people, particularly women and children, have historically been excluded from political participation and treated as dependents rather than autonomous actors. The separation between public and private spheres that underlies much liberal political theory may serve to protect certain forms of domination and inequality within families, while claiming to guarantee equality in political life. Moreover, the individualistic assumptions of Lockean philosophy may fail to capture important aspects of human experience that are inherently relational, such as pregnancy, child-rearing, and care for elderly or disabled family members. These activities are essential for social reproduction and human flourishing, but they do not fit easily into frameworks that emphasize individual autonomy and voluntary exchange as the primary models for legitimate social relationships. Feminist theorists have proposed various modifications to liberal theory that would better acknowledge interdependence and care, while preserving commitments to equality and freedom. Critical race theorists have similarly challenged the universality and neutrality that Lockean philosophy claims for its principles by showing how those principles have been applied selectively in ways that reinforce rather than challenge racial hierarchies. The same natural rights arguments that justified independence from colonial rule were used by white settlers to dispossess indigenous peoples of their traditional lands, often through legal and philosophical arguments that denied the full humanity or proper property rights of non-European peoples. The labour theory of property was interpreted in ways that privileged European-style agriculture over indigenous hunting and gathering practices, even when those practices represented sustainable and productive uses of natural resources. Constitutional protections for individual rights coexisted for centuries with slavery and legal segregation, suggesting that abstract principles alone are insufficient to guarantee equal treatment without ongoing political struggle to ensure inclusive implementation. These historical patterns raise questions about whether the apparent universality of liberal principles masks particular cultural assumptions that continue to privilege some groups over others in subtle but systematic ways. Critical race theory calls for more explicit attention to how philosophical principles interact with existing power structures and social inequalities, rather than assuming that formal equality will automatically produce substantive justice. Communitarian critics argue that Locke's individualistic assumptions fail to capture the fundamentally social nature of human identity and moral development. People do not enter social relationships as fully formed individuals with predetermined interests and values, but rather develop their identities, goals, and moral commitments through participation in particular communities and cultural traditions. The values of individual autonomy and voluntary choice that liberalism celebrates may themselves be products of specific historical and cultural circumstances, rather than universal features of human nature that apply equally across all societies and time periods. Moreover, excessive emphasis on individual rights and market relationships may undermine the social bonds and shared commitments that are necessary for healthy communities and effective democratic participation. Communitarians propose various ways of balancing individual freedom with social solidarity, often emphasizing civic virtue, political participation, and cultural tradition as sources of meaning and value that complement but do not eliminate individual liberty. These approaches seek to preserve what is valuable in Lockean liberalism while addressing its potential tendency toward atomistic individualism that ignores human social needs. Environmental philosophers have identified serious limitations in Locke's property theory and its implications for humanity's relationship with the natural world. The Labour theory of property assumes that human beings have the right to appropriate and transform natural resources for their own purposes, without considering the intrinsic value of natural systems or the rights of other species that depend on those systems for their survival. The emphasis on economic productivity and material improvement may justify forms of environmental exploitation that are unsustainable in the long term and that impose costs on future generations who had no voice in the decisions that created those problems. Contemporary environmental crises like climate change, biodiversity loss, and resource depletion suggest that unlimited individual appropriation of natural resources may be incompatible with long-term human flourishing and ecological stability. Environmental theorists have proposed various modifications to liberal property theory that would incorporate ecological limits, intergenerational justice, and recognition of non-human interests into frameworks for economic and political decision-making. These approaches often emphasize stewardship rather than ownership as the appropriate model for human relationships with natural resources, though they disagree about how such principles should be institutionalized in practice. Postmodern and postcolonial thinkers have challenged the epistemological foundations of Locke's philosophy by questioning whether empirical observation and rational argument can provide objective, universal knowledge that transcends particular cultural perspectives and power relationships. The apparent neutrality of scientific method and logical reasoning may mask cultural assumptions and social interests that shape what counts as legitimate knowledge and whose voices are taken seriously in intellectual debates. The emphasis on individual rational judgment may privilege certain forms of thinking and communicating, while marginalizing alternative ways of understanding the world that are equally valid, but less familiar to dominant cultural groups. Post-colonial theorists have shown how European philosophical traditions, including liberalism, were often complicit in colonial projects that imposed particular ways of organizing society and understanding reality on peoples with different cultural traditions and social practices. These critics do not necessarily reject all aspects of liberal philosophy, but they call for greater awareness of its cultural specificity and its potential complicity in various forms of domination that operate through knowledge production as well as through more obvious forms of political and economic power. They propose more pluralistic approaches to knowledge and social organization that would be more respectful of cultural difference, while still maintaining possibilities for communication and cooperation across cultural boundaries. Despite these serious criticisms, many contemporary philosophers argue that Lockean principles remain valuable resources for addressing current challenges, though they may need to be interpreted and applied in new ways that take account of changed circumstances and expanded understanding of human diversity and social complexity. The basic insights about individual dignity, popular consent, limited government and intellectual freedom continue to provide important protections against various forms of tyranny and oppression, even if they need to be supplemented with additional principles that address their limitations. Democratic institutions based on Lockean foundations have shown remarkable adaptability and have been successfully extended to include previously excluded groups, suggesting that the principles themselves may be more flexible and inclusive than their original formulations indicated. Contemporary human rights movements, environmental protection efforts, and democratic transitions around the world continue to draw on Lockean themes while adapting them to local circumstances and current challenges. The key may be to treat Locke's ideas as starting points for ongoing moral and political reflection, rather than as finished systems that provide final answers to all important questions about how human societies should be organized. His greatest contribution may lie not in the specific solutions he proposed, but in the framework he established for thinking systematically about the relationship between individual freedom and social cooperation in ways that take both human dignity and practical effectiveness seriously. The future development of Lockean philosophy will likely involve creative synthesis with insights from other philosophical traditions that address some of its limitations while preserving its core commitments to human equality, rational inquiry, and accountable government. This might include incorporating feminist insights about care and interdependence, communitarian insights about social solidarity and civic virtue, environmental insights about ecological limits and intergenerational responsibility, and multicultural insights about diversity and inclusion. The challenge will be to develop approaches that are both theoretically coherent and practically effective in promoting human flourishing under contemporary conditions that differ significantly from those that Locke himself experienced. This ongoing work of philosophical reflection and institutional innovation represents the best way of honouring Locke's intellectual legacy, while ensuring that his insights continue to serve human needs in a rapidly changing world. The goal is not to preserve his ideas unchanged, but to continue the project of critical thinking about fundamental questions of human knowledge, morality, and politics that he initiated with such remarkable insight and influence. In that sense, the most genuinely Lockean approach to contemporary problems may be to apply his methods of careful empirical observation and rational analysis to current circumstances, rather than simply repeating his specific conclusions about the very different circumstances he faced. The enduring power of John Locke's philosophy lies not in providing permanent answers, but in establishing productive ways of asking essential questions about human nature, knowledge, and social organization. His empirical approach to understanding how minds work, his contractual approach to understanding how governments acquire legitimacy, and his natural rights approach to understanding what humans owe each other, continue to offer valuable resources for contemporary reflection, even when his specific answers seem inadequate or incomplete. The measure of a great philosopher is not whether their ideas remain unchanged across centuries, but whether they continue to stimulate serious thinking about fundamental questions that each generation must answer for itself, based on its own experience and circumstances. By that standard, John Locke remains one of the most influential and important thinkers in the history of human thought, whose insights continue to shape our understanding of what it means to be human in an organized society committed to both individual dignity and collective flourishing.